Chapter 6, Part 1 of the Life of Washington, Volume 4, by John Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6, Part 1. Meeting of Congress, President's Speech, Report of the Secretary of the Treasury on Public Credit, Debate thereon, Bill for fixing the permanent seat of government, Adjournment of Congress, Treaty with the Creek Indians, Relations of the United States with Great Britain and Spain, the President visits Mount Vernon, Session of Congress, the President's Speech, Debates on the Excise, on a National Bank, the Opinions of the Cabinet on the Law, Progress of Parties, War with the Indians, Defeat of Harmar, Adjournment of Congress. 1790. Meeting of the Second Session of the First Congress. On the 8th of January, 1790, the President met both Houses of Congress in the Senate Chamber. In his speech, which was delivered from the chair of the Vice President after congratulating Congress on the accession of the important state of North Carolina to the Union and on the prosperous aspect of American affairs, he proceeded to recommend certain great objects of legislation to their more especial consideration. Among the many interesting objects, continued the speech, which will engage your attention, that of providing for the common defense will merit your particular regard. To be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace. A free people ought not only to be armed, but disciplined, to which end a uniform and well-digested plan is requisite, and their safety and interest require that they should promote such manufactories as tend to render them independent on others for essential, particularly for military supplies. As connected with this subject, a proper establishment for the troops, which they might deem indispensable, was suggested for their mature deliberation, and the indications of a hostile temper given by several tribes of Indians were considered as admonishing them of the necessity of being prepared to afford protection to the frontiers and to punish aggression. The interests of the United States were declared to require that the means of keeping up their intercourse with foreign nations should be provided, and the expediency of establishing a uniform rule of naturalization was suggested. After expressing his confidence in their attention to many improvements essential to the prosperity of the interior, the President added, "Nor am I less persuaded that you will agree with me in opinion that there is nothing which can better deserve your patronage than the promotion of science and literature. Knowledge is in every country the surest basis of public happiness. In one in which the measures of government receive their impression so immediately from the sense of the community as in ours, it is proportionably essential to the security of a free constitution. It contributes in various ways by convincing those who are entrusted with the public administration that every valuable end of government is best answered by the enlightened confidence of the people, and by teaching the people themselves to know and to value their own rights, to discern and provide against invasions of them, to distinguish between oppression and the necessary exercise of lawful authority, between burdens proceeding from a disregard to their convenience and those resulting from the inevitable exigencies of society, to discriminate the spirit of liberty from that of licentiousness, cherishing the first, avoiding the last, and uniting a speedy but temperate vigilance against encroachments with an inviolable respect to the laws. Whether this desirable object will be best promoted by affording aids to seminaries of learning already established, by the institution of a national university, or by any other expedients, will be well worthy of a place in the deliberations of the legislature. Addressing himself then particularly to the representatives, he said, "I saw with peculiar pleasure at the close of the last session the resolution entered into by you, expressive of your opinion that an adequate provision for the support of the public credit is a matter of high importance to the national honor and prosperity. In this sentiment I entirely concur, and to a perfect confidence in your best endeavors to devise such a provision as will be truly consistent with the end, I add an equal reliance on the cheerful cooperation of the other branch of the legislature. It would be superfluous to specify inducements to a measure in which the character and permanent interests of the United States are so obviously and so deeply concerned, and which has received so explicit a sanction from your declaration." Addressing himself again to both houses, he observed that the estimates and papers respecting the objects particularly recommended to their attention would be laid before them, and concluded with saying, "The welfare of our country is the great object to which our cares and efforts ought to be directed, and I shall derive great satisfaction from a cooperation with you in the pleasing though arduous task of ensuring to our fellow citizens the blessings which they have a right to expect from a free, efficient, and equal government." The answers of both houses were indicative of the harmony which subsisted between the executive and legislative departments. Congress had been so occupied during its first session with those bills which were necessary to bring the new system into full operation and to create an immediate revenue that some measures which possess great and pressing claims to immediate attention have been unavoidably deferred. That neglect under which the creditors of the public have been permitted to languish could not fail to cast an imputation on the American republics, which have been sincerely lamented by the wisest among those who administered the former government. The power to comply substantially with the engagements of the United States being at length conferred on those who were bound by them, it was confidently expected by the friends of the Constitution that their country would retrieve its reputation, and that its fame would no longer be tarnished with the blots which stain a faithless people. Report of the Secretary of the Treasury of a plan for the support of public credit. On the 9th of January, a letter from the Secretary of the Treasury to the Speaker of the House of Representatives was read, stating that in obedience to the resolution of the 21st of September, he had prepared a plan for the support of public credit, which he was ready to report when the House should be pleased to receive it. And after a short debate, in which the personal attendance of the Secretary for the purpose of making explanations was urged by some and opposed by others, it was resolved that the report should be received in writing on the succeeding Thursday. Availing himself of the latitude afforded by the terms of the resolution under which he acted, the Secretary had introduced into his report an able and comprehensive argument, elucidating and supporting the principles it contained. After displaying with strength and perspicuity the justice and the policy of an adequate provision for the public debt, he proceeded to discuss the principles on which it should be made. It was agreed, he said, by all that the foreign debt should be provided for according to the precise terms of the contract. It was to be regretted that, with respect to the domestic debt, the same unanimity of sentiment did not prevail. The first point on which the public appeared to be divided involved the question whether a discrimination ought not to be made between original holders of the public securities and present possessors by purchase. After reviewing the arguments generally urged in its support, the Secretary declared himself against this discrimination. He deemed it equally unjust and impolitic, highly injurious even to the original holders of public securities, and ruinous to public credit. To the arguments with which he enforced these opinions, he added the authority of the government of the Union. From the circular address of Congress to the States of the 26th of April, 1783, accompanying their revenue system of the 18th of the same month, passages were selected indicating unequivocally that in the view of that body the original creditors and those who had become so by assignment had equal claims upon the nation. After reasoning at great length against a discrimination between the different creditors of the Union, the Secretary proceeded to examine whether a difference ought to be permitted to remain between them and the creditors of individual states. Both descriptions of debt were contracted for the same objects and were in the main the same. Indeed, a great part of the particular debts of the states had arisen from assumptions by them on account of the Union, and it was most equitable that there should be the same measure of retribution for all. There were many reasons, some of which were stated, for believing this would not be the case unless the state debts should be assumed by the nation. In addition to the injustice of favoring one class of creditors more than another, which was equally meritorious, many arguments were urged in support of the policy of distributing to all with an equal hand from the same source. After an elaborate discussion of these and some other points connected with the subject, the Secretary proposed that a loan should be opened to the full amount of the debt, as well of the particular states as of the Union. The terms to be offered were, first, that for every $100 subscribed payable in the debt, as well interest as principal, the subscriber should be entitled to have 2/3 funded on a yearly interest of 6%, the capital redeemable at the pleasure of government by the payment of the principal. and to receive the other third in lands of the Western Territory at their then actual value, or, secondly, to have the whole sum funded at a yearly interest of 4%, irredeemable by any payment exceeding $5 per annum, both on account of principal and interest, and to receive as a compensation for the reduction of interest $15.80, payable in lands, as in the preceding case. Or, thirdly, to have 66 2/3 of a dollar funded at a yearly interest of 6%, irredeemable also by any payment exceeding $4 2/3 of a dollar per annum, on account both of principal and interest, and to have at the end of 10 years $26.88 funded at the like interest and rate of redemption. In addition to these propositions, the creditors were to have an option of vesting their money in annuities on different plans, and it was also recommended to open a loan at 5% for $10 millions, payable one half in specie and the other half in the debt, irredeemable by any payment exceeding $6 per annum, both of principal and interest. By way of experiment, a tontine on principles stated in the report was also suggested. The Secretary was restrained from proposing to fund the whole debt immediately at the current rate of interest by the opinion that although such a provision might not exceed the abilities of the country, it would require the extension of taxation to a degree and to objects which the true interest of the creditors themselves would forbid. It was therefore to be hoped and expected that they would cheerfully concur in such modifications of their claims on fair and equitable principles as would facilitate to the government an arrangement substantial, durable, and satisfactory to the community. Exigencies might ere long arise which would call for resources greatly beyond what was now deemed sufficient for the current service, and should the faculties of the country be exhausted, or even strained to provide for the public debt, there could be less reliance on the sacredness of the provision. But while he yielded to the force of these considerations, he did not lose sight of those fundamental principles of good faith which dictate that every practicable exertion ought to be made scrupulously to fulfill the engagements of government, that no change in the rights of its creditors ought to be attempted without their voluntary consent, and that this consent ought to be voluntary in fact as well as in name. Consequently, that every proposal of a change ought to be in the shape of an appeal to their reason and to their interest, not to their necessities. To this end it was requisite that a fair equivalent should be offered for what might be asked to be given up, and unquestionable security for the remainder. This fair equivalent for the proposed reduction of interest was, he thought, offered in the relinquishment of the power to redeem the whole debt at pleasure. That a free judgment might be exercised by the holders of public securities in accepting or rejecting the terms offered by the government, provision was made in the report for paying to non-subscribing creditors a dividend of the surplus which should remain in the Treasury after paying the interest of the proposed loans. But as the funds immediately to be provided were calculated to produce only 4% on the entire debt, the dividend for the present was not to exceed that rate of interest. To enable the Treasury to support this increased demand upon it, an augmentation of the duties on imported wines, spirits, tea, and coffee was proposed, and a duty on home-made spirits was also recommended. This celebrated report, which has been alike the fruitful theme of extravagant praise and bitter censure, merits the more attention because the first regular and systematic opposition to the principles on which the affairs of the Union were administered originated in the measures which were founded on it. On the 28th of January this subject was taken up, and after some animadversions on the speculations in the public debt to which the report, it was said, had already given birth, the business was postponed until the 8th of February, when it was again brought forward. Debate thereon. Several resolutions affirmative of the principles contained in the report were moved by Mr. Fitzsimmons. To the first, which respected a provision for the foreign debt, the House agreed without a dissenting voice. The second, in favor of appropriating permanent funds for payment of the interest on the domestic debt and for the gradual redemption of the principal, gave rise to a very animated debate. Mr. Jackson declared his hostility to funding systems generally, To prove their pernicious influence, he appealed to the histories of Florence, Genoa, and Great Britain, and contending that the subject ought to be deferred until North Carolina should be represented, moved that the committee should rise. This question being decided in the negative, Mr. Scott declared the opinion that the United States were not bound to pay the domestic creditors the sum specified in the certificates of debts in their possession. He supported this opinion by urging, not that the public had received less value than was expressed on the face of the paper which had been issued, but that those to whom it had been delivered, by parting with it at 2 shillings and 6pence in the pound, had themselves fixed the value of their claims, and had manifested their willingness to add to their other sacrifices this deduction from their demand upon the nation. He therefore moved to amend the resolution before the committee, so as to require a resettlement of the debt. The amendment was opposed by Mr. Boudinot, Mr. Lawrence, Mr. Ames, Mr. Sherman, Mr. Hartley, and Mr. Goodhue. They stated at large the terms on which the debt had been contracted, and urged the confidence which the creditors had a right to place in the government for its discharge according to settlements already made and acknowledgments already given. The idea that the legislative body could diminish an ascertained debt was reprobated with great force, as being at the same time unjust, impolitic, and subversive of every principle on which public contracts are founded. The evidences of debt possessed by the creditors of the United States were considered as public bonds, for the redemption of which the property and the labor of the people were pledged. After the debate had been protracted to some length, the question was taken on Mr. Scott's amendment, and it passed in the negative. Mr. Madison then arose, and in an eloquent speech, replete with argument, proposed an amendment to the resolution, the effect of which was to discriminate between the public creditors so as to pay the present holder of assignable paper the highest price it had borne in the market, and give the residue to the person with whom the debt was originally contracted. Where the original creditor had never parted with his claim, he was to receive the whole sum acknowledged to be due on the face of the certificate. This motion was supported by Mr. Jackson, Mr. White, Mr. Moore, Mr. Page, Mr. Stone, Mr. Scott, and Mr. Seney. It was opposed with great earnestness and strength of argument by Mr. Sedgwick, Mr. Lawrence, Mr. Smith of South Carolina, Mr. Ames, Mr. Gary, Mr. Boudinot, Mr. Wadsworth, Mr. Goodhue, Mr. Hartley, Mr. Bland, Mr. Benson, Mr. Burke, and Mr. Livermore. The argument was ably supported on both sides, was long, animated, and interesting. At length the question was put, and the amendment was rejected by a great majority. This discussion deeply engaged the public attention. The proposition was new and interesting. That the debt ought to be diminished for the public advantage was an opinion which had frequently been advanced and was maintained by many. But a reduction from the claims of its present holders for the benefit of those who had sold their rights was a measure which saved nothing to the public purse, and was therefore recommended only by consideration, the operation of which can never be very extensive. Against it were arranged all who had made purchases, and a great majority of those who conceive that sound policy and honest dealing require a literal observance of public contracts. Although the decision of Congress against the discrimination in favor of the original creditor produced no considerable sensation, the determination on that part of the Secretary's report, which was the succeeding subject of deliberation, affecting political interests and powers which are never to be approached without danger, seemed to unchain all those fierce passions which a high respect for the government and for those who administered it had in a great measure restrained. The manner in which the several states entered into and conducted the War of the Revolution will be recollected, acting in some respects separately and in others conjointly for the attainment of a common object. Their resources were exerted, sometimes under the authority of Congress, sometimes under the authority of the local government, to repel the enemy wherever he appeared. The debt incurred in support of the war was therefore in the first instance contracted partly by the continent and partly by the states. When the system of requisitions was adopted, the transactions of the Union were carried on almost entirely through the agency of the states, and when the measure of compensating the army for the depreciation of their pay became necessary, this burden under the recommendation of Congress was assumed by the respective states. Some had funded this debt and paid the interest upon it. Others had made no provision for the interest, but all, by taxes, paper money, or purchase, had in some measure reduced the principal. In their exertions some degree of inequality had obtained, and they looked anxiously to a settlement of accounts for the ascertainments of claims which each supposed itself to have upon the Union. Measures to effect this object had been taken by the former government, but they were slow in their progress, and intrinsic difficulties were found in the thing itself, not easily to be overcome. The Secretary of the Treasury proposed to assume these debts and to fund them in common with that which continued to be the proper debt of the Union. The resolution which comprehended this principle of the report was vigorously opposed. It was contended that the general government would acquire an undue influence and that the state governments would be annihilated by the measure. Not only would all the influence of the public creditors be thrown into the scale of the former, but it would absorb all the powers of taxation and leave to the latter only the shadow of a government. This would probably terminate in rendering the state governments useless, and would destroy the system so recently established. The Union, it was said, had been compared to a rope of sand, but gentlemen were cautioned not to push things to the opposite extreme. The attempt to strengthen it might be unsuccessful, and the cord might be strained until it should break. The constitutional authority of the federal government to assume the debts of the states was questioned. Its powers, it was said, were specified, and this was not among them. The policy of the measure, as it affected merely the government of the Union, was controverted, and its justice was arraigned. On the ground of policy, it was objected that the assumption would impose on the United States a burden the weight of which was unascertained, and which would require an extension of taxation beyond the limits which prudence would prescribe. An attempt to raise the impost would be dangerous, and the excise added to it would not produce funds adequate to the object. A tax on real estate must be resorted to, objections to which have been made in every part of the Union. It would be more advisable to leave this source of revenue untouched in the hands of the state governments, who could apply to it with more facility, with a better understanding of the subject, and with less dissatisfaction to individuals than could possibly be done by the government of the United States. There existed no necessity for taking up this burden. The state creditors had not required it. There was no petition from them upon the subject. There was not only no application from the states, but there was reason to believe that they were seriously opposed to the measure. Many of them would certainly view it with a jealous, a jaundiced eye. The Convention of North Carolina, which adopted the Constitution, had proposed as an amendment to it to deprive Congress of the power of interfering between the respective states and their creditors, and there could be no obligation to assume more than the balances which on a final settlement would be found due to creditor states. That the debt, by being thus accumulated, would be perpetuated was also an evil of real magnitude. Many of the states had already made considerable progress in extinguishing their debts, and the process might certainly be carried on more rapidly by them than by the Union. A public debt seemed to be considered by some as a public blessing, but to this doctrine they were not converts. If, as they believed, a public debt was a public evil, it would be enormously increased by adding those of the states to that of the Union. The measure was unwise, too, as it would affect public credit. Such an augmentation of the debt must inevitably depreciate its value, since it was the character of paper, whatever denomination it might assume, to diminish in value in proportion to the quantity in circulation. It would also increase an evil which was already sensibly felt. The state debts, when assumed by the continent, would, as that of the Union had already done, accumulate in large cities, and the dissatisfaction excited by the payment of taxes would be increased by perceiving that the money raised from the people flowed into the hands of a few individuals. Still greater mischief was to be apprehended. A great part of this additional debt would go into the hands of foreigners, and the United States would be heavily burdened to pay an interest which could not be expected to remain in the country. The measure was unjust because it was burdening those states which had taxed themselves highly to discharge the claims of their creditors with the debts of those which had not made the same exertions. It would delay the settlement of accounts between the individual states and the United States, and the supporters of the measure were openly charged with intending to defeat that settlement. It was also said that in its execution the scheme would be found extremely embarrassing, perhaps impracticable. The case of a partial accession to the measure by the creditors, a case which would probably occur, presented a difficulty for which no provision was made, and of which no solution had been given. Should the creditors in some states come into the system, and those in others refuse to change their security, the government would be involved in perplexities from which no means of extricating itself had been shown. Nor would it be practicable to discriminate between the debts contracted for general and for local objects. In the course of the debate, severe allusions were made to the conduct of particular states, and the opinions advanced in favor of the measure were ascribed to local interests. In support of the assumption, the debts of the states were traced to their origin. America, it was said, had engaged in a war the object of which was equally interesting to every part of the Union. It was not the war of a particular state, but of the United States. It was not the liberty and independence of a part, but of the whole, for which they had contended and which they had acquired. The cause was a common cause. As brethren, the American people had consented to hazard property and life in its defense. All the sums expended in the attainment of this great object, whatever might be the authority under which they were raised or appropriated, conduced to the same end. Troops were raised and military stores purchased before Congress assumed the command of the army or the control of the war. The ammunition which repulsed the enemy at Bunker's Hill was purchased by Massachusetts and formed a part of the debt of that state. Nothing could be more erroneous than the principle which had been assumed in argument, that the holders of securities issued by individual states were to be considered merely as state creditors. As if the debt had been contracted on account of the particular state, it was contracted on account of the Union, in that common cause in which all were equally interested. From the complex nature of the political system which had been adopted in America, the war was in a great measure carried on through the agency of the state governments, and the debts were in truth the debts of the Union, for which the states had made themselves responsible. Except the civil list, the whole state expenditure was in the prosecution of the war, and the state taxes had undeniably exceeded the provision for their civil list. The foundation for the several classes of the debt was reviewed in detail, and it was affirmed to be proved from the review and from the books in the public offices that in its origin, a great part of it, even in form, and the whole in fact, was equitably due from the continent. The states, individually possessing all the resources of the nation, became responsible to certain descriptions of the public creditors, but they were the agents of the continent in contracting the debt, and its distribution among them for payment arose from the division of political power which existed under the old Confederation. A new arrangement of the system had taken place, and a power over the resources of the nation was conferred on the general government. With the funds, the debt also ought to be assumed. This investigation of its origin demonstrated that the assumption was not the creation of a new debt, but the re-acknowledgment of liability for an old one, the payment of which had devolved on those members of the system who at the time were alone capable of paying it. And thence was inferred not only the justice of the measure, but a complete refutation of the arguments drawn from the Constitution. If, in point of fact, the debt was in its original continental, and had been transferred to the states for greater facility of payment, there could be no constitutional objection to restoring its original and real character. The great powers of war, of taxation, and of borrowing money, which were vested in Congress to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, comprised that in question. There could be no more doubt of their right to charge themselves with the payment of a debt contracted in the past war than to borrow money for the prosecution of a future war. The impolicy of leaving the public creditors to receive payment from different sources was also strongly pressed, and the jealousy which would exist between the creditors of the Union and of the states was considered as a powerful argument in favor of giving them one common interest. This jealousy, it was feared, might be carried so far as even to create an opposition to the laws of the Union. If the states should provide for their creditors, the same sum of money must be collected from the people as would be required if the debt should be assumed, and it would probably be collected in a manner more burdensome than if one uniform system should be established. If all should not make such provision, it would be unjust to leave the soldier of one state unpaid, while the services of the man who fought by his side were amply compensated. And after having assumed the funds, it would dishonor the general government to permit a creditor for services rendered or property advanced for the continent to remain unsatisfied because his claim had been transferred to the state at a time when the state alone possessed the means of payment. By the injured and neglected creditor, such an arrangement might justly be considered as a disreputable artifice. Instead of delaying, it was believed to be a measure which would facilitate the settlement of accounts between the states. Its advocates declared that they did not entertain, and never had entertained, any wish to procrastinate a settlement. On the contrary, it was greatly desired by them They had themselves brought forward propositions for that purpose, and they invited their adversaries to assist in improving the plan which had been introduced. The settlement between the States, it was said, either would or would not be made. Should it ever take place, it would remedy any inequalities which might grow out of the assumption. Should it never take place, the justice of the measure became the more apparent. That the burdens in support of a common war, which from various causes had devolved unequally on the States, ought to be apportioned among them, was a truth too clear to be controverted. And this, if the settlement should never be accomplished, could be effected only by the measure now proposed. Indeed, in any event, it would be the only certain as well as only eligible plan. For how were the debtor States to be compelled to pay the balances which should be found against them? If the measure was recommended by considerations which rendered its ultimate adoption inevitable, the present was clearly preferable to any future time. It was desirable immediately to quiet the minds of the public creditors by assuring them that justice would be done, to simplify the forms of public debt, and to put an end to that speculation which had been so much reprobated, and which could be terminated only by giving the debt a real and permanent value. That the assumption would impair the just influence of the States was controverted with great strength of argument. The diffusive representation in the State legislatures, the intimate connection between the representative and his constituents, the influence of the State legislatures over the members of one branch of the national legislature, the nature of the powers exercised by the State governments, which perpetually presented them to the people in a point of view calculated to lay hold of the public affections, were guarantees that the States would retain their due weight in the political system, and that a debt was not necessary to the solidity or duration of their power. But the argument, it was said, proved too much. If a debt was now essential to the preservation of State authority, it would always be so. It must therefore never be extinguished, but must be perpetuated in order to secure the existence of the State governments. If for this purpose it was indispensable that the expenses of the Revolutionary War should be borne by the States, it would not be less indispensable that the expenses of future wars should be borne in the same manner. Either the argument was unfounded, or the Constitution was wrong, and the powers of the sword and the purse ought not to have been conferred on the government of the Union. Whatever speculative opinions might be entertained on this point, they were to administer the government according to the principles of the Constitution as it was framed. But it was added, if so much power follows the assumption, as the objection implies, is it not time to ask, is it safe to forbear assuming? If the power is so dangerous, it will be so when exercised by the States. If assuming tends to consolidation, is the reverse, tending to disunion, a less weighty objection? If it is answered that the non-assumption will not necessarily tend to disunion, neither, it may be replied, does the assumption necessarily tend to consolidation. It was not admitted that the assumption would tend to perpetuate the debt. It could not be presumed that the general government would be less willing than the local governments to discharge it, nor could it be presumed that the means were less attainable by the former than the latter. It was not contended that a public debt was a public blessing. Whether a debt was to be preferred to no debt was not the question. The debt was already contracted, and the question, so far as policy might be consulted, was whether it was more for the public advantage to give it such a form as would render it applicable to the purposes of a circulating medium, or to leave it a mere subject of speculation, incapable of being employed to any useful purpose. The debt was admitted to be an evil, but it was an evil from which, if wisely modified, some benefit might be extracted, and which in its present state could have only a mischievous operation. If the debt should be placed on adequate funds, its operation on public credit could not be pernicious. In its present precarious condition, there was much more to be apprehended in that respect. To the objection that it would accumulate in large cities, it was answered, it would be a moneyed capital, and would be held by those who chose to place money at interest. But by funding the debt, the present possessors would be enabled to part with it at its nominal value instead of selling it at its present current rate. If it should center in the hands of foreigners, the sooner it was appreciated to its proper standard, the greater quantity of specie would its transfer bring into the United States. To the injustice of charging those states which had made great exertions for the payment of their debts with the burden properly belonging to those which had not made such exertions, it was answered that every state must be considered as having exerted itself to the utmost of its resources, and that if it could not or would not make provision for creditors to whom the Union was equitably bound, the argument in favor of an assumption was the stronger. The arguments drawn from local interests were repelled and retorted, and a great degree of irritation was excited on both sides. After a very animated discussion of several days, the question was taken, and the resolution was carried by a small majority. Soon after this decision, while the subject was pending before the House, the delegates from North Carolina took their seats and changed the strength of parties. By a majority of 2 voices, the resolution was recommitted, and after a long and ardent debate was negatived by the same majority. This proposition continued to be supported with a degree of earnestness which its opponents termed pertinacious, but not a single opinion was changed. It was brought forward in the new and less exceptionable form of assuming specific sums from each state. Under this modification of the principle, the extraordinary contributions of particular states during the war and their exertions since the peace might be regarded, and the objections to the measure, drawn from the uncertainty of the sum to be assumed, would be removed. But these alterations produced no change of sentiment, and the bill was sent up to the Senate with a provision for those creditors only whose certificates of debt purported to be payable by the Union. In this state of things, the measure is understood to have derived aid from another, which was of a nature strongly to interest particular parts of the Union. From the month of June, 1783, when Congress was driven from Philadelphia by the mutiny of a part of the Pennsylvania line, the necessity of selecting some place for a permanent residence in which the government of the Union might exercise sufficient authority to protect itself from violence and insult had been generally acknowledged. Scarcely any subject had occupied more time or had more agitated the members of the former Congress than this. End of Chapter 6, Part 1. Chapter 6, Part 2 of The Life of Washington, Volume 4, by John Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In December 1784, an ordinance was passed for appointing commissioners to purchase land on the Delaware, in the neighborhood of its falls, and to erect thereon the necessary public buildings for the reception of Congress and the officers of government. But the Southern interest had been sufficiently strong to arrest the execution of this ordinance by preventing an appropriation of funds, which required the assent of 9 states. Under the existing government, this subject had received the early attention of Congress, and many different situations from the Delaware to the Potomac inclusive had been earnestly supported, but a majority of both houses had not concurred in favor of any one place. With as little success, attempts had been made to change the temporary residence of Congress, although New York was obviously too far to the east. So many conflicting interests were brought into operation whenever the subject was touched, that no motion designating a more central place could succeed. At length a compact respecting the temporary and permanent seat of government was entered into between the Friends of Philadelphia and the Potomac, stipulating that Congress should adjourn to and hold its sessions in Philadelphia for 10 years, during which time buildings for the accommodation of the government should be erected at some place on the Potomac, to which the government should remove at the expiration of the term. This compact having united the representatives of Pennsylvania and Delaware with the Friends of the Potomac in favor both of the temporary and permanent residence which had been agreed on between them, a majority was produced in favor of the 2 situations, and a bill which was brought into the Senate in conformity with this previous arrangement passed both houses by small majorities. This act was immediately followed by an amendment to the bill then pending before the Senate for funding the debt of the Union. The amendment was similar in principle to that which had been unsuccessfully proposed in the House of Representatives. By its provisions, $21,500,000 of the state debts were assumed in specified proportions, and it was particularly enacted that no certificate should be received from a state creditor which could be ascertained to have been issued for any purpose other than compensations and expenditures for services or supplies towards the prosecution of the late war and the defense of the United States or of some part thereof during the same. When the question was taken in the House of Representatives on this amendment, 2 members representing districts on the Potomac, who in all the previous stages of the business had voted against the assumption, declared themselves in its favor, and thus the majority was changed. Thus was a measure carried which was supported and opposed with a degree of zeal and earnestness not often manifested, and which furnished presages not to be mistaken that the spirit with which the opposite opinions have been maintained would not yield contentedly to the decision of a bare majority. This measure has constituted one of the great grounds of accusation against the first administration of the general government, and it is fair to acknowledge that though in its progress it derived no aid from the President, whose opinion remained in his own bosom, it received the full approbation of his judgment. A bill at length passed both houses funding the debt upon principles which lessened considerably the weight of the public burdens, and was entirely satisfactory to the public creditors. The proceeds of the sales of the lands lying in the Western Territory, and by a subsequent act of the same session, the surplus product of the revenue, after satisfying the appropriations which were charged upon it, with the addition of $2 millions, which the President was authorized to borrow at 5 per centum, constitute a sinking fund to be applied to the reduction of the debt. The effect of this measure was great and rapid. The public paper suddenly rose and was for a short time above par. The immense wealth which individuals acquired by this unexpected appreciation could not be viewed with indifference. Those who participated in its advantages regarded the author of a system to which they were so greatly indebted with an enthusiasm of attachment to which scarcely any limits were assigned. To many others this adventitious collection of wealth in particular hands was a subject rather of chagrin than of pleasure, and the reputation which the success of his plans gave to the Secretary of the Treasury was not contemplated with unconcern. As if the debt had been created by the existing government, not by a war which gave liberty and independence to the United States, its being funded was ascribed by many not to a sense of justice and to a liberal and enlightened policy, but to the desire of bestowing on the government an artificial strength by the creation of a moneyed interest which would be subservient to its will. The effects produced by giving the debt a permanent value justified the predictions of those whose anticipations had been most favorable. The sudden increase of moneyed capital derived from it invigorated commerce and gave a new stimulus to agriculture. About this time there was a great and visible improvement in the circumstances of the people. Although the funding system was certainly not inoperative in producing this improvement, it cannot be justly ascribed to any single cause. Progressive industry had gradually repaired the losses sustained by the war, and the influence of the Constitution on habits of thinking and acting, though silent, was considerable in depriving the states of the power to impair the obligation of contracts or to make anything but gold and silver a tender in payment of debts. The conviction was impressed on that portion of society which had looked to the government for relief from embarrassment, that personal exertions alone could free them from difficulties, and an increased degree of industry and economy was the natural consequence of this opinion. Adjournment of Congress. On the 12th of August, after an arduous session, Congress adjourned to meet in Philadelphia the first Monday in the following December. While the discussions in the national legislature related to subjects and were conducted in a temper well calculated to rouse the active spirit of party, the external relations of the United States wore an aspect not perfectly serene. To the hostile temper manifested by the Indians on the western and southern frontiers, an increased degree of importance was given by the apprehension that their discontents were fomented by the intrigues of Britain and of Spain. From Canada, the Indians of the Northwest were understood to be furnished with the means of prosecuting a war which they were stimulated to continue, and to the influence of the governor of the Floridas had been partly attributed the failure of the negotiation with the Creeks. That this influence would still be exerted to prevent a friendly intercourse with that nation was firmly believed, and it was feared that Spain might take a part in the open hostilities threatened by the irritable dispositions of individuals in both countries. From the intimate connections subsisting between the members of the House of Bourbon, this event was peculiarly deprecated, and the means of avoiding it were sought with solicitude. These considerations determined the President to make another effort at negotiation. But to preserve the respect of these savages for the United States, it was at the same time resolved that the agent to be employed should visit the country on other pretexts and should carry a letter of introduction to McGillivray, blending with other subjects a strong representation of the miseries which a war with the United States would bring upon his people, and an earnest exhortation to repair with the chiefs of his nation to the seat of the federal government in order to effect a solid and satisfactory peace. Colonel Willett was selected for this service, and he acquitted himself so well of the duty assigned to him as to induce the chiefs of the nation, with McGillivray at their head, to repair to New York, where negotiations were opened, which terminated in a treaty of peace signed on the 7th day of August. Treaty with the Creek Indians. The Pacific overtures made to the Indians of the Wabash and the Miamis not having been equally successful, the western frontiers were still exposed to their destructive incursions. A long course of experience had convinced the President that on the failure of negotiation, sound policy and true economy, not less than humanity, required the immediate employment of a force which should carry death and destruction into the heart of the hostile settlements. Either not feeling the same impressions or disposed to indulge the wishes of the Western people, who declared openly their preference for desultory military expeditions, Congress did not adopt measures corresponding with the wishes of the executive, and the military establishment was not equal to the exigency. The distresses of the frontier establishment therefore still continued, and the hostility they had originally manifested to the Constitution sustained no diminution. United States in relations with Great Britain and Spain. No progress had been made in adjusting the points of controversy with Spain and Britain. With the former power, the question of boundary remained unsettled, and the cabinet of Madrid discovered no disposition to relax the rigor of its pretensions respecting the navigation of the Mississippi. Its general conduct furnished no foundation for a hope that its dispositions towards the United States were friendly, or that it could view their growing power without jealousy. The non-execution of the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th Articles of the Treaty of Peace still furnished the United States and Great Britain with matter for reciprocal recrimination, which there was the more difficulty in removing because no diplomatic intercourse was maintained between them. The cabinet of St. James having never appointed a minister to the United States, and Mr. Adams having returned from London without effecting the object of his mission, the American government felt some difficulty in repeating advances which had been treated with neglect. Yet there was much reason to desire full explanations with the English government, and to understand perfectly its views and intentions. The subjects for discussion were delicate in their nature and could not be permitted to remain in their present state without hazarding the most serious consequences. The detention of a part of the territory of the United States was a circumstance of much importance to the honor as well as to the interests of the nation, and that commercial intercourse between the two countries was so extensive as to require amicable and permanent regulations. The early attention of the President had been directed to these subjects, and in October 1789 he had resolved on taking informal measures to sound the British cabinet and to ascertain its views respecting them. This negotiation was entrusted to Mr. Gouverneur Morris, who had been carried by private business to Europe, and he conducted it with ability and address, but was unable to bring it to a happy conclusion. The result of his conferences with the Duke of Leeds and with Mr. Pitt was a conviction that the British government, considering the posts they occupied on the southern side of the Great Lakes as essential to their monopoly of the fur trade, would surrender them reluctantly, and was not desirous of entering into a commercial treaty. Those ministers expressed a wish to be on the best terms with America, but repeated the complaints which had been previously made by Lord Carmarthen of the non-execution of the Treaty of Peace on the part of the United States, to the observations made by Mr. Morris that the Constitution lately adopted and the courts established under it amounted to a full compliance with that treaty on the part of the American government. It was answered that losses had already been sustained in consequence of the obstructions given by the States to the fair operation of that instrument, which rendered a faithful observance of it at present impossible. And in a note, the Duke of Leeds avowed the intention, if the delay on the part of the American government to fulfill its engagements made in the treaty should have rendered their final completion impracticable, to retard the fulfillment of those which depended entirely on Great Britain until redress should be granted to the subjects of His Majesty on the specific points of the treaty itself, or a fair and just compensation obtained for the non-performance of those stipulations which the United States had failed to observe. Though urged by Mr. Morris to state explicitly in what respects and to what degree he considered the final completion of those engagements to which the United States were bound as having been rendered impracticable, no such statement was given, and the British government seemed inclined to avoid for the present those full and satisfactory explanations which were sought on the part of the United States. After detailing the motives which in his opinion influenced the English cabinet in wishing to suspend for a time all discussions with America, Mr. Morris observed, "Perhaps there never was a moment in which this country felt herself greater, and consequently it is the most unfavorable moment to obtain advantageous terms from her in any bargain." While these negotiations were pending, intelligence was received at London of the attack made on the British settlement of Nootka Sound, and preparations were instantly made to resent the insult alleged to have been offered to the nation. The high ground taken on this occasion by the government, and the vigor with which it armed in support of its pretensions, furnished strong reasons for the opinion that a war with Spain, and probably with France, would soon be commenced. In America this was considered as a favorable juncture for urging the claims of the United States to the free navigation of the Mississippi. Mr. Carmichael, their charge d'affaires at the court of Madrid, was instructed not only to press this point with earnestness, but to use his utmost endeavors to secure the unmolested use of that river in future by obtaining a cession of the islands of New Orleans and of the Floridas. A full equivalent for this cession would be found, it was said, in the sincere friendship of the United States and in the security it would give to the territories of Spain west of the Mississippi. Mr. Carmichael was also instructed to point the attention of the Spanish government to the peculiar situation of the United States. To one half of their territory the use of the Mississippi was indispensable. No efforts could prevent their acquiring it. That they would acquire it, either by acting separately or in conjunction with Great Britain, was one of those inevitable events against which human wisdom could make no provision. To the serious consideration of the Spanish government, therefore, were submitted the consequences which must result to their whole empire in America, either from hostilities with the United States or from a seizure of Louisiana by Great Britain. The opinion that in the event of war between Great Britain and Spain, Louisiana would be invaded from Canada was not a mere suggestion for the purpose of aiding the negotiations at Madrid. It was seriously adopted by the American government, and the attention of the executive was turned to the measures which it would be proper to take should application be made for permission to march a body of troops through the unsettled territories of the United States into the dominions of Spain, or should the attempt be made to march them without permission. Among the circumstances which contributed to the opinion that in the event of war the arms of Great Britain would be directed against the settlements of Spain in America was the continuance of Lord Dorchester in the government of Canada. This nobleman had intimated a wish to visit New York on his return to England, but the prospect of a rupture with Spain had determined him to remain in Canada under the pretext of making his acknowledgments. For the readiness with which his desire to pass through New York had been acceded to, his lordship dispatched Major Beck with a member of his family to sound the American government, and if possible to ascertain its dispositions towards the two nations. Alluding to the negotiations which had been commenced in London, this gentleman endeavored to assign a satisfactory cause for the delays which had intervened. It was not improbable, he said, that these delays and some other circumstances might have impressed Mr. Morris with an idea of backwardness on the part of the British ministry. His lordship, however, had directed him to say that an inference of this sort would not, in his opinion, be well founded, as he had reason to believe that the British cabinet was inclined not only towards a friendly intercourse, but towards an alliance with the United States. Major Beckwith represented the particular ground of quarrel as one which ought to interest all commercial nations in favor of the views of Great Britain, and from that circumstance he presumed that, should a war ensue, the United States would find their interest in taking part with Britain rather than with Spain. After expressing the concern with which Lord Dorchester had heard of the depredations of the savages on the western frontier of the United States, he declared that his lordship, so far from countenancing these depredations, had taken every proper opportunity to impress upon the Indians a pacific disposition, and that on his first hearing of the outrages lately committed, he had sent a messenger to endeavor to prevent them. Major Beckwith further intimated that the perpetrators of the late murders were banditti, composed chiefly of Creeks and Cherokees, in the Spanish interest, over whom the governor of Canada possessed no influence. These communications were laid before the President and appeared to him to afford an explanation of the delays experienced by Mr. Morris. He was persuaded that a disposition existed in the Cabinet of London to retain things in their actual situation until the intentions of the American government should be ascertained with respect to the war supposed to be approaching. If the United States would enter into an alliance with Great Britain and would make a common cause with her against Spain, the way would be smooth to the attainment of all their objects. But if America should be disinclined to such a connection, and especially if she should manifest any partiality towards Spain, no progress would be made in the attempt to adjust the point of difference between the two nations. Taking this view of the subject, he directed that the further communications of Mr. Beckwith should be heard civilly, and that their want of official authenticity should be hinted delicately, without using any expressions which might, in the most remote degree, impair the freedom of the United States to pursue, without reproach, in the expected war, such a line of conduct as their interests or honor might dictate. In the opinion that it would not only be useless, but dishonorable further to press a commercial treaty or the exchange of ministers, and that the subject of the Western posts ought not again to be moved on the part of the United States until they should be in a condition to speak a decisive language, the powers given to Mr. Morris were withdrawn. Should the interest of Britain produce a disposition favorable to an amicable arrangement of differences and to a liberal commercial intercourse secured by compact, it was believed that she would make the requisite advances. Until then, or until some other change of circumstances should require a change of conduct, things were to remain in their actual situation. About the time of adopting this resolution, the dispute between Britain and Spain was adjusted. Finding France unwilling to engage in his quarrel, his Catholic Majesty, too weak to encounter alone the force of the British Empire, yielded every point in controversy, and thus were terminated for the present both the fear of inconveniences and the hope of advantages which might result to America from hostilities between the two powers whose dominions were in her neighborhood, and with each of whom she was already engaged in controversies not easily to be accommodated. The President visits Mount Vernon. Incessant application to public business and the consequent change of active for sedentary habits had greatly impaired the constitution of the President, and during the last session of Congress he had, for the second time since entering on the duties of his present station, been attacked by a severe disease which reduced him to the brink of the grave. Exercise and a temporary relief from the cares of office being essential to the restoration of his health, he determined, for the short interval afforded by the recess of the legislature, to retire to the tranquil shades of Mount Vernon. After returning from a visit to Rhode Island, which state, not having then adopted the American Constitution, had not been included in his late tour through New England, he took leave of New York, and hastened to that peaceful retreat and those rural employments, his taste for which neither military glory nor political power could ever diminish. After a short indulgence in these favorite scenes, it became necessary to repair to Philadelphia in order to meet the national legislature. The President's speech. In the speech delivered to Congress at the commencement of their third session, the President expressed much satisfaction at the favorable prospect of public affairs, and particularly noticed the progress of public credit and the productiveness of the revenue. Adverting to foreign nations, he said, the disturbed situation of Europe, and particularly the critical posture of the great maritime powers, whilst it ought to make us more thankful for the general peace and security enjoyed by the United States, reminds us at the same time of the circumspection with which it becomes us to preserve these blessings. It requires also that we should not overlook the tendency of a war, and even of preparations for war, among the nations most concerned in active commerce with this country, to abridge the means, and thereby at least to enhance the price of transporting its valuable productions to their proper market. To the serious reflection of Congress was recommended the prevention of embarrassments from these contingencies by such encouragement to American navigation as would render the commerce and agriculture of the United States less dependent on foreign bottoms. After expressing to the House of Representatives his confidence arising from the sufficiency of the revenues already established for the objects to which they were appropriated, he added, "Allow me, moreover, to hope that it will be a favorite policy with you, not merely to secure a payment of the interest of the debt funded, but as far and as fast as the growing resources of the country will permit, to exonerate it of the principal itself. Many subjects relative to the interior government were succinctly and briefly mentioned, and the speech concluded with the following impressive and admonitory sentiment: "In pursuing the various and weighty business of the present session, I indulge the fullest persuasion that your consultations will be marked with wisdom and animated by the love of country. In whatever belongs to my duty, you shall have all the cooperation which an undiminished zeal for its welfare can inspire. It will be happy for us both, and our best reward, if by a successful administration of our respective trusts we can make the established government more and more instrumental in promoting the good of our fellow citizens, and more the object of their attachment and confidence." The addresses of the two houses in answer to this speech proved that the harmony between the executive and legislative departments with which the government had gone into operation had sustained no essential interruption. But in the short debate which took place on the occasion in the House of Representatives, a direct disapprobation of one of the measures of the executive government was for the first time openly expressed. In the treaty lately concluded with the Creeks, an extensive territory claimed by Georgia under treaties, the validity of which was contested by the Indian chiefs, had been entirely or in great part relinquished. This relinquishment excited serious discontents in that state, and was censured by General Jackson with considerable warmth as an unjustifiable abandonment of the rights and interests of Georgia. No specific motion, however, was made, and the subject was permitted to pass away for the present. Scarcely were the debates on the address concluded when several interesting reports were received from the Secretary of the Treasury, suggesting such further measures as were deemed necessary for the establishment of public credit. It will be recollected that in his original report on this subject the Secretary had recommended the assumption of the state debts, and had proposed to enable the Treasury to meet the increased demand upon it, which this measure would occasion, by an augmentation of the duties on imported wines, spirits, tea, and coffee, and by imposing duties on spirits distilled within the country. The assumption not having been adopted until late in this session, the discussion on the revenue which would be required for this portion of the public debt did not commence until the House had become impatient for an adjournment. As much contrariety of opinion was disclosed, and the subject did not press, it was deferred to the ensuing session, and an order was made requiring the Secretary of the Treasury to prepare a report such further provision as might, in his opinion, be necessary for establishing the public credit. In obedience to this order, several reports have been prepared, the first of which repeated the recommendation of an additional impost on foreign distilled spirits and of a duty on spirits distilled within the United States. The estimated revenue from these sources was $877,500, affording a small excess over the sum which would be required to pay the interest on the assumed debt. The policy of the measure was discussed in a well-digested and able argument, detailing many motives, in addition to those assigned in his original report, for preferring the system now recommended to accumulated burdens on commerce or to a direct tax on lands. A new tax is the certain rallying point for all those who are unfriendly to the administration or to the minister by whom it is proposed, but that recommended by the Secretary contained intrinsic causes of objection which would necessarily add to the number of its enemies. All that powerful party in the United States which attached itself to the local rather than to the general government would inevitably contemplate any system of internal revenue with jealous disapprobation. They consider the imposition of a tax by Congress on any domestic manufacture as the intrusion of a foreign power into their particular concerns, which excited serious apprehensions for state importance and for liberty. In the real or supposed interests of many individuals was also found a distinct motive for hostility to the measure. A large portion of the American population, especially that which had spread itself over the extensive regions of the West, consuming imported articles to a very inconsiderable amount, was not much affected by the impost on foreign merchandise. But the duty on spirits distilled within the United States reached them, and consequently rendered them hostile to the tax. 1791. Debate on the excise law. A bill which was introduced in pursuance of the report was opposed with great vehemence by a majority of the Southern and Western members. By some of them it was insisted that no sufficient testimony had yet been exhibited that the taxes already imposed would not be equal to the exigencies of the public. But admitting the propriety of additional burdens on the people, it was contended that other sources of revenue, less exceptionable and less odious than this, might be explored. The duty was branded with the hateful epithet of an excise, a species of taxation, it was said, so peculiarly oppressive as to be abhorred even in England, and which was totally incompatible with the spirit of liberty. The facility with which it might be extended to other objects was urged against its admission into the American system, and declarations made against it by the Congress of 1775 were quoted in confirmation of the justice with which inherent vices were ascribed to this mode of collecting taxes. So great was the hostility manifested against it in some of the states that the revenue officers might be endangered from the fury of the people, and in all it would increase a ferment which had been already extensively manifested. Resolutions of Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina reprobating the assumption were referred to as unequivocal evidences of growing dissatisfaction, and the last mentioned state had even expressed its decided hostility to any law of excise. The legislature of North Carolina had rejected with scorn a proposal for taking an oath to support the Constitution of the United States, had refused to admit persons sentenced to imprisonment under the laws of the United States into their jails, and another circumstance was alluded to, but not explained, which was said to exhibit a temper still more hostile to the general government than either of those which had been stated. When required to produce a system in lieu of that which they so much execrated, the opponents of a bill alternately mentioned an increased duty on imported articles generally, a particular duty on molasses, a direct tax, a tax on salaries, pensions, and lawyers, a duty on newspapers, and a stamp act. The friends of the bill contended that the reasons for believing the existing revenue would be insufficient to meet the engagements of the United States were as satisfactory as the nature of the case would admit, or as ought to be required. The estimates were founded on the best data which were attainable, and the funds already provided had been calculated by the proper officer to pay the interest on that part of the debt only for which they were pledged. Those estimates were referred to as documents from which it would be unsafe to depart. They were also in possession of official statements showing the productiveness of the taxes from the time the revenue bill had been in operation, and arguments were drawn from these, demonstrating the danger to which the infant credit of the United States would be exposed by relying on the existing funds for the interest on the assumed debt. It was not probable that the proposed duties would yield a sum much exceeding that which would be necessary, but should they fortunately do so, the surplus revenue might be advantageously employed in extinguishing a part of the principal. They were not, they said, of opinion that a public debt was a public blessing, or that it ought to be perpetuated. An augmentation of the revenue being indispensable to the solidity of the public credit, a more eligible system than that proposed in the bill could not, it was believed, be devised. Still further to burden commerce would be a hazardous experiment, which might afford no real supplies to the Treasury. Until some light should be derived from experience, it behooved the legislature to be cautious not to lay such impositions upon trade as might probably introduce a spirit of smuggling, which with a nominal increase would occasion a real diminution of revenue. In the opinion of the best judges, the impost on the mass of foreign merchandise could not safely be carried further for the present. The extent of the mercantile capital of the United States would not justify the attempt. Forcible arguments were also drawn from the policy and the justice of multiplying the subjects of taxation and diversifying them by a union of internal with external objects. Neither would a direct tax be advisable. The experience of the world had proved that a tax on consumption was less oppressive and more productive than a tax on either property or income. Without discussing the principles on which the fact was founded, the fact itself was incontestable that by insensible means much larger sums might be drawn from any class of men than could be extracted from them by open and direct taxes. To the latter system there were still other objections. The difficulty of carrying it into operation, no census having yet been taken, would not be inconsiderable, and the expense of collection through a country thinly settled would be enormous. Add to this that public opinion was believed to be more decidedly and unequivocally opposed to it than to a duty on ardent spirits. North Carolina had expressed her hostility to the one as well as to the other, and several other states were known to disapprove of direct taxes. From the real objections which existed against them, and for other reasons suggested in the report of the Secretary, they ought, it was said, to remain untouched as a resource when some great emergency should require an exertion of all the faculties of the United States. Against the substitution of a duty on internal negotiations, it was said that revenue to any considerable extent could be collected from them only by means of a stamp act, which was not less obnoxious to popular resentment than an excise, would be less certainly productive than the proposed duties and was in every respect less eligible. The honor, the justice, and the faith of the United States were pledged, it was said, to that class of creditors for whose claims the bill under consideration was intended to provide. No means of making the provision had been suggested, which on examination would be found equally eligible with a duty on ardent spirits. Much of the public prejudice, which appeared in certain parts of the United States against the measure, was to be ascribed to their hostility to the term excise, a term which had been inaccurately applied to the duty in question. When the law should be carried into operation, it would be found not to possess those odious qualities which had excited resentment against a system of excise. In those states where the collection of a duty on spirits distilled within the country had become familiar to the people, the same prejudices did not exist. On the good sense and virtue of the nation they could confidently rely for acquiescence in a measure which the public exigencies rendered necessary, which tended to equalize the public burdens, and which, in its execution, would not be oppressive. A motion made by Mr. Jackson to strike out that section which imposed a duty on domestic distilled spirits was negatived by 36 to 16, and the bill was carried by 35 to 21. End of Chapter 6, Part 2. Chapter 6, Part 3 of The Life of Washington, Volume 4, by John Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6, Part 3 on a National Bank. The Secretary of the Treasury had been the uniform advocate of a national bank, believing that such an institution would be of primary importance to the prosperous administration of the finances and of the greatest utility in the operations connected with the support of public credit. He had earnestly recommended its adoption in the first general system, which he presented to the view of Congress, and at the present session had repeated that recommendation in a special report containing a copious and perspicuous argument on the policy of the measure. A bill conforming to the plan he suggested was sent down from the Senate and was permitted to proceed unmolested in the House of Representatives to the third reading. On the final question, a great, and it would seem an unexpected opposition was made to its passage. Mr. Madison, Mr. Giles, Mr. Jackson, and Mr. Stone spoke against it. The general utility of banking systems was not admitted, and the particular bill before the House was censured on its merits, but the great strength of the argument was directed against the constitutional authority of Congress to pass an act for incorporating a national bank. The government of the United States, it was said, was limited, and the powers which it might legitimately exercise were enumerated in the Constitution itself. In this enumeration the power now contended for was not to be found. Not being expressly given, it must be implied from those which were given, or it could not be vested in the government. The clauses under which it could be claimed were then reviewed and critically examined, and it was contended that on fair construction no one of these could be understood to imply so important a power as that of creating a corporation. The clause which enables Congress to pass all laws necessary and proper to execute the specified powers must, according to the natural and obvious force of the terms and the context, be limited to means necessary to the end and incident to the nature of the specified powers. The clause, it was said, was in fact merely declaratory of what would have resulted by unavoidable implication as the appropriate and, as it were, technical means of executing those powers. Some gentlemen observed that the true exposition of a necessary mean to produce a given end was that mean without which the end could not be produced. The bill was supported by Mr. Ames, Mr. Sedgwick, Mr. Smith of South Carolina, Mr. Lawrence, Mr. Boudinot, Mr. Gary, and Mr. Vining. The utility of banking institutions was said to be demonstrated by their effects. In all commercial countries they had been resorted to as an instrument of great efficacy in mercantile transactions, and even in the United States their public and private advantages had been felt and acknowledged. Respecting the policy of the measure, no well-founded doubt could be entertained, but the objections to the constitutional authority of Congress deserve to be seriously considered. That the government was limited by the terms of its creation was not controverted, and that it could exercise only those powers which were conferred on it by the Constitution was admitted. If on examination that instrument should be found to forbid the passage of the bill, it must be rejected, though it would be with deep regret that its friends would suffer such an opportunity of serving their country to escape for the want of a constitutional power to improve it. In asserting the authority of the legislature to pass the bill, gentlemen contended that incidental as well as express powers must necessarily belong to every government, and that when a power is delegated to effect particular objects, all the known and usual means of effecting them must pass as incidental to it. To remove all doubt on this subject, the Constitution of the United States had recognized the principle by enabling Congress to make all laws which may be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the powers vested in the government. They maintained the sound construction of this grant to be a recognition of an authority in the national legislature to employ all the known and usual means for executing the powers vested in the government. They then took a comprehensive view of those powers and contended that a bank was a known and usual instrument by which several of them were exercised. After a debate of great length, which was supported on both sides with ability and with that ardor which was naturally excited by the importance attached by each party to the principle in contest, the question was put, and the bill was carried in the affirmative by a majority of 19 voices. The opinions of the Cabinet on the constitutionality of this last law. The point which had been agitated with so much zeal in the House of Representatives was examined with equal deliberation by the Executive. The Cabinet was divided upon it. The Secretary of State and the Attorney General conceived that Congress had clearly transcended their constitutional powers, while the Secretary of the Treasury, with equal clearness, maintained the opposite opinion. The advice of each minister, with his reasoning in support of it, was required in writing, and their arguments were considered by the President with all that attention which the magnitude of the question and the interest taken in it by the opposing party so eminently required. This deliberate investigation of the subject terminated in a conviction that the Constitution of the United States authorized the measure, and the sanction of the Executive was given to the act. Progress of parties. The judgment is so much influenced by the wishes, the affections, and the general theories of those by whom any political proposition is decided, that a contrariety of opinion on this great constitutional question ought to excite no surprise. It must be recollected that the conflict between the powers of the general and state governments was coeval with those governments. Even during the war, the preponderance of the states was obvious, and in a very few years after peace, the struggle ended in the utter abasement of the general government. Many causes concurred to produce a constitution which was deemed more competent to the preservation of the Union, but its adoption was opposed by great numbers, and in some of the large states especially, its enemies soon felt and manifested their superiority. The old line of division was still as strongly marked as ever. Many retained the opinion that liberty could be endangered only by encroachments upon the states, and that it was the great duty of patriotism to restrain the powers of the general government within the narrowest possible limits. In the other party, which was also respectable for its numbers, many were found who had watched the progress of American affairs, and who sincerely believed that the real danger which threatened the Republic was to be looked for in the undue ascendancy of the states. To them it appeared that the substantial powers and the extensive means of influence which were retained by the local sovereignties furnished them with weapons for aggression which were not easily to be resisted, and that it behooved all those who were anxious for the happiness of their country to guard the equilibrium established in the Constitution by preserving, unimpaired, all the legitimate powers of the Union. These were more confirmed in their sentiments by observing the temper already discovered in the legislatures of several states respecting the proceedings of Congress. To this great and radical division of opinion, which would necessarily affect every question on the authority of the national legislature, other motives were added which were believed to possess considerable influence on all measures connected with the finances. As an inevitable effect of the state of society, the public debt had greatly accumulated in the middle and northern states, whose inhabitants had derived from its rapid appreciation a proportional augmentation of their wealth. This circumstance could not fail to contribute to the complacency with which the plans of the Secretary were viewed by those who had felt their benefit, nor to the irritation with which they were contemplated by others who had parted with their claims on the nation. It is not impossible that personal considerations also mingled themselves with those which were merely political. With so many causes to bias the judgment, it would not have been wonderful if arguments less plausible than those advanced by either party had been deemed conclusive on its adversary. Nor was it a matter of surprise that each should have denied to those which were urged in opposition the weight to which they were certainly entitled. The liberal mind, which can review them without prejudice, will charge neither the supporters nor the opponents of the bill with insincerity, nor with being knowingly actuated by motives which might not have been avowed. This measure made a deep impression on many members of the legislature, and contributed not inconsiderably to the complete organization of those distinct and visible parties which, in their long and dubious conflict for power, have since shaken the United States to their center. Among the last acts of the present Congress was an act to augment the military establishment of the United States. War with the Indians. The earnest endeavors of the President to give security to the northwestern frontiers by pacific arrangements having been entirely unavailing, it became his duty to employ such other means as were placed in his hands for the protection of the country. Confirmed by all his experience in the opinion that vigorous offensive operations alone could bring an Indian war to a happy conclusion, he had planned an expedition against the hostile tribes northwest of the Ohio as soon as the impracticability of effecting a treaty with them had been ascertained. General Harmar, a veteran of the Revolution who had received his appointment under the former government, was placed at the head of the Federal troops. On the 30th of September he marched from Fort Washington with 320 regulars. The whole army, when joined by the militia of Pennsylvania and Kentucky, amounted to 1,453 men. About the middle of October, Colonel Hardin, who commanded the Kentucky militia and who had been also a Continental officer of considerable merit, was detached at the head of 600 men, chiefly militia, to reconnoiter the ground and to ascertain the intentions of the enemy. On his approach, the Indians set fire to their principal village and fled with precipitation to the woods. As the object of the expedition would be only half accomplished unless the savages could be brought to action and defeated, Colonel Hardin was again detached at the head of 210 men, 30 of whom were regulars. About 10 miles west of Chillicothe, where the main body of the army lay, he was attacked by a party of Indians. The Pennsylvanians, who composed his left column, had previously fallen in the rear, and the Kentuckians, disregarding the exertions of their colonel and of a few other officers, fled on the first appearance of an enemy. The small corps of regulars, commanded by Lieutenant Armstrong, made a brave resistance. After 23 of them had fallen in the field, the surviving 7 made their escape and rejoined the army. Defeat of Harmar. Notwithstanding this check, the remaining towns on the Scioto were reduced to ashes, and the provisions laid up for the winter were entirely destroyed. This service being accomplished, the army commenced its march towards Fort Washington. Being desirous of wiping off the disgrace which his arms had sustained, General Harmar halted about 8 miles from Chillicothe, and once more detached Colonel Hardin with orders to find the enemy and bring on an engagement. His command consisted of 360 men, of whom 60 were regulars, commanded by Major Willis. Early the next morning, this detachment reached the confluence of the St. Joseph and St. Mary, where it was divided into 3 columns. The left division, commanded by Colonel Hardin in person, crossed the St. Joseph and proceeded up its western bank. The center, consisting of the Federal troops, was led by Major Willis up the eastern side of that river, and the right, under the command of Major McMillan, marched along a range of heights which commanded the right flank of the center division. The columns had proceeded but a short distance when each was met by a considerable body of Indians, and a severe engagement ensued. The militia retrieved their reputation, and several of their bravest officers fell. The heights on the right having been, from some cause not mentioned, unoccupied by the American troops, the savages seized them early in the action and attacked the right flank of the center with great fury. Although Major Willis was among the first who fell, the battle was maintained by the regulars with spirit, and considerable execution was done on both sides. At length the scanty remnant of this small band, quite overpowered by numbers, was driven off the ground, leaving 50 of their comrades, exclusive of Major Willis and Lieutenant Fotheringham, dead upon the field. The loss sustained by the militia was also considerable. It amounted to upwards of 100 men, among whom were 9 officers. After an engagement of extreme severity, the detachment joined the main army, which continued its march to Fort Washington. General Harmar, with what propriety it is not easy to discern, claimed the victory. He conceived, not entirely without reason, that the loss of a considerable number of men would be fatal to the Indians, although a still greater loss should be sustained by the Americans, because the savages did not possess a population from which they could replace the warriors who had fallen. The event, however, did not justify this opinion. The information respecting this expedition was quickly followed by intelligence stating the deplorable condition of the frontiers. An address from the representatives of all the counties of Kentucky and those of Virginia bordering on the Ohio was presented to the President, praying that the defense of the country might be committed to militia unmixed with regulars, and that they might immediately be drawn out to oppose the exulting foe. To this address the President gave a conciliatory answer, but he understood too well the nature of the service to yield to the request it contained. Such were his communications to the legislature that a regiment was added to the permanent military establishment, and he was authorized to raise a body of 2,000 men for 6 months, and to appoint a major general and a brigadier general to continue in command so long as he should think their services necessary. Adjournment of Congress. With the 3rd of March, 1791, terminated the first Congress elected under the Constitution of the United States. The party denominated Federal, having prevailed at the elections, a majority of the members were steadfast friends of the Constitution, and were sincerely desirous of supporting a system they had themselves introduced, and on the preservation of which, in full health and vigor, they firmly believed the happiness of their fellow citizens and the respectability of the nation greatly to depend. To organize a government, to retrieve the national character, to establish a system of revenue, and to create public credit were among the arduous duties which were imposed upon them by the political situation of their country. With persevering labor, guided by no inconsiderable portion of virtue and intelligence, these objects were in a great degree accomplished. Out of the measures proposed for their attainment, questions alike intricate and interesting unavoidably arose. It is not in the nature of man to discuss such questions without strongly agitating the passions and exciting irritations which do not readily subside. Had it even been the happy and singular lot of America to see its national legislature assemble uninfluenced by those prejudices which grew out of the previous divisions of the country, the many delicate points which they were under the necessity of deciding could not have failed to disturb this enviable state of harmony, and to mingle some share of party spirit with their deliberations. But when the actual state of the public mind was contemplated, and due weight was given to the important consideration that, at no very distant day, a successor to the present chief magistrate must be elected, it was still less to be hoped that the first Congress could pass away without producing strong and permanent dispositions in parties to impute to each other designs unfriendly to the public happiness. As yet, however, these imputations did not extend to the President. His character was held sacred, and the purity of his motives was admitted by all. Some divisions were understood to have found their way into the Cabinet. It was insinuated that between the Secretaries of State and of the Treasury very serious differences had arisen, but these high personages were believed to be equally attached to the President, who was not suspected of undue partiality to either. If his assent to the bill for incorporating the National Bank produced discontent, the opponents of that measure seemed disposed to ascribe his conduct in that instance to his judgment rather than to any prepossession in favor of the party by whom it was carried. The opposition, therefore, in Congress to the measures of the government seemed to be leveled at the Secretary of the Treasury and at the Northern members by whom those measures were generally supported, not at the President by whom they were approved. By taking this direction, it made its way into the public mind without being encountered by that devoted affection which a great majority of the people felt for the chief magistrate of the Union. In the meantime, the national prosperity was in a state of rapid progress, and the government was gaining, though slowly, in the public opinion. But in several of the state assemblies, especially in the southern division of the continent, serious evidences of dissatisfaction were exhibited, which demonstrated the jealousy with which the local sovereignties contemplated the powers exercised by the federal legislature. End of Chapter 6, Part 3. Chapter 7, Part 1 of the Life of Washington, Volume 4, by John Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7, Part 1. General St. Clair appointed Commander-in-Chief. The President makes a tour through the Southern States. Meeting of Congress. President's speech. Debate on the bill for apportioning representatives. Militia law. Defeat of St. Clair. Opposition to the increase of the Army. Report of the Secretary of the Treasury for raising additional supplies. Congress adjourns. Strictures on the conduct of administration with the view of parties. Disagreement between the Secretaries of State and Treasury. Letters from General Washington. Opposition to the excise law. President's proclamation. Insurrection and massacre in the island of St. Domingo. General Wayne appointed to the command of the Army. Meeting of Congress. President's speech. Resolutions implicating the Secretary of the Treasury rejected. Congress adjourns. Progress of the French Revolution and its effects on parties in the United States. 1791. General St. Clair appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Army. More ample means for the protection of the frontiers having been placed in the hands of the executive, the immediate attention of the President was directed to this interesting object. Major General Arthur St. Clair, governor of the territory northwest of the Ohio, was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the forces to be employed in the meditated expedition. This gentleman had served through the War of the Revolution with reputation, though it had never been his fortune to distinguish himself. The evacuation of Ticonderoga had indeed at one time subjected him to much public censure, but it was found upon inquiry to be unmerited. Other motives, in addition to the persuasion of his fitness for the service, conduced to his appointment. With the sword, the olive branch was still to be tendered, and it was thought advisable to place them in the same hands. The governor, having been made officially the negotiator with the tribes inhabiting the territories over which he presided, being a military man, acquainted with the country into which the war was to be carried, possessing considerable influence with the inhabitants of the frontiers, and being so placed as to superintend the preparations for the expedition advantageously, seemed to have claims to the station which were not to be overlooked. It was also a consideration of some importance that the high rank he had held in the American army would obviate those difficulties in filling the inferior grades with men of experience, which might certainly be expected should a person who had acted in a less elevated station be selected for the chief command. Tomb of Mary, Mother of Washington. This is the original monument as it appeared before the present granite obelisk was erected over the grave of George Washington's mother in Fredericksburg, Virginia. It was in Fredericksburg that she made her home during her declining years, and it was on the Kenmore estate of her daughter Elizabeth and son-in-law Fielding Lewis that she was buried, September 1789, having survived her husband, Augustine Washington, 46 years. The President makes a tour through the Southern States. After making the necessary arrangements for recruiting the Army, the President prepared to make his long-contemplated tour through the Southern States. In passing through them, he was received universally with the same marks of affectionate attachment which he had experienced in the northern and central parts of the Union. To the sensibilities which these demonstrations of the regard and esteem of good men could not fail to inspire was added the high gratification produced by observing the rapid improvements of the country and the advances made by the government in acquiring the confidence of the people. The numerous letters written by him after his return to Philadelphia attest the agreeable impressions made by these causes. "In my late tour through the Southern States," said he, in a letter of the 28th of July to Mr. Gouverneur Morris, "I experienced great satisfaction in seeing the good effects of the general government in that part of the Union. The people at large have felt the security which it gives, and the equal justice which it administers to them. The farmer, the merchant, and the mechanic have seen their several interests attended to, and from thence they unite in placing a confidence in their representatives, as well as in those in whose hands the execution of the laws is placed. Industry has there taken place of idleness and economy of dissipation. 2 or 3 years of good crops and a ready market for the produce of their lands have put every one in good humor, and in some instances they even impute to the government what is due only to the goodness of Providence. The establishment of public credit is an immense point gained in our national concerns. This, I believe, exceeds the expectation of the most sanguine among us, and a late instance, unparalleled in this country, has been given of the confidence reposed in our measures, by the rapidity with which the subscriptions to the Bank of the United States were filled. In 2 hours after the books were opened by the commissioners, the whole number of shares was taken up, and 4,000 more applied for than were allowed by the institution. This circumstance was not only pleasing, as it related to the confidence in government, but also as it exhibited an unexpected proof of the resources of our citizens. This visit had undoubtedly some tendency to produce the good disposition which the President observed with so much pleasure. The affections are perhaps more intimately connected with the judgment than we are disposed to admit, and the appearance of the Chief Magistrate of the Union, who was the object of general love and reverence, could not be without its influence in conciliating the minds of many to the government he administered and to its measures. But this progress towards conciliation was perhaps less considerable than was indicated by appearances. The hostility to the government, which was coeval with its existence, though diminished, was far from being subdued, and under this smooth exterior was concealed a mass of discontent, which, though it did not obtrude itself on the view of the man who united almost all hearts, was active in its exertions to effect its objects. The difficulties which must impede the recruiting service in a country where coercion is not employed, and where the common wages of labor greatly exceed the pay of a soldier, protracted the completion of the regiments to a late season of the year, but the summer was not permitted to waste in total inaction. The act passed at the last session for the defense of the frontiers, in addition to its other provisions, had given to the President an unlimited power to call mounted militia into the field. Under this authority, 2 expeditions had been conducted against the villages on the Wabash, in which a few of the Indian warriors were killed, some of their old men, women, and children were made prisoners, and several of their towns and fields of corn were destroyed. The first was led by General Scott in May, and the second by General Wilkinson in September. These desultory incursions had not much influence on the war. It was believed in the United States that the hostility of the Indians was kept up by the traders living in their villages. These persons had generally resided in the United States, and having been compelled to leave the country in consequence of the part they had taken during the War of the Revolution, felt the resentments which banishment and confiscation seldom failed to inspire. Their enmities were ascribed by many, perhaps unjustly, to the temper of the government in Canada, but some countenance seemed to be given to this opinion by intelligence that about the commencement of the preceding campaign large supplies of ammunition had been delivered from the British posts on the lakes to the Indians at war with the United States. While the President was on his Southern tour, he addressed a letter to the Secretary of State to be communicated to Colonel Beckwith, who still remained in Philadelphia as the informal representative of his nation, in which he expressed his surprise and disappointment at this interference by the servants or subjects of a foreign state in a war prosecuted by the United States for the sole purpose of procuring peace and safety for the inhabitants of their frontiers. On receiving this communication, Colonel Beckwith expressed his disbelief that the supplies mentioned had been delivered, but on being assured of the fact, he avowed the opinion that the transaction was without the knowledge of Lord Dorchester, to whom he said he should communicate without delay the ideas of the American government on the subject. Meeting of Congress. President's speech. On the 24th of October, the Second Congress assembled in Philadelphia. In his speech at the opening of the session, the President expressed his great satisfaction at the prosperous situation of the country, and particularly mentioned the rapidity with which the shares in the Bank of the United States were subscribed as among the striking and pleasing evidences which presented themselves, not only of confidence in the government, but of resources in the community. Adverting to the measures which have been taken in execution of the laws and resolutions of the last session, the most important of which, he observed, respected the defense and security of the western frontiers. He had, he said, negotiated provisional treaties and used other proper means to attach the wavering and to confirm in their friendship the well-disposed tribes of Indians. The means which he had adopted for pacification with those of a hostile description having proved unsuccessful, offensive operations have been directed, some of which had proved completely successful, and others were still pending. Overtures of peace were still continued to the deluded tribes, and it was sincerely to be desired that all need of coercion might cease, and that an intimate intercourse might succeed, calculated to advance the happiness of the Indians and to attach them firmly to the United States. In marking the line of conduct which ought to be maintained for the promotion of this object, he strongly recommended justice to the savages and such rational experiments for imparting to them the blessings of civilization as might from time to time suit their condition, and then concluded this subject with saying, a system corresponding with the mild principles of religion and philanthropy towards an unenlightened race of men whose happiness materially depends on the conduct of the United States would be as honorable to the national character as conformable to the dictates of sound policy. After stating that measures have been taken for carrying into execution the act laying duties on distilled spirits, he added, the impressions with which this law has been received by the community have been, upon the whole, such as were to have been expected among enlightened and well-disposed citizens, from the propriety and necessity of the measure. The novelty, however, of the tax in a considerable part of the United States and the misconception of some of its provisions have given occasion in particular places to some degree of discontent. But it is satisfactory to know that this disposition yields to proper explanations and more just apprehensions of the true nature of the law, and I entertain a full confidence that it will in all give way to motives which arise out of a just sense of duty and a virtuous regard to the public welfare. If there are any circumstances in the law which, consistently with its main design, may be so varied as to remove any well-intentioned objections that may happen to exist, it will comport with a wise moderation to make the proper variations. It is desirable on all occasions to unite with a steady and firm adherence to constitutional and necessary acts of government the fullest evidence of a disposition, as far as may be practicable, to consult the wishes of every part of the community, and to lay the foundations of the public administration in the affections of the people. The answers of the two houses noticed briefly and generally the various topics of the speech, and though perhaps less warm than those of the preceding Congress, manifested great respect for the executive magistrate and an undiminished confidence in his patriotic exertions to promote the public interests. Debate on the bill for apportioning representatives among the people of the States according to the first enumeration. Among the first subjects of importance which engaged the attention of the legislature was a bill for apportioning representatives among the people of the several States according to the first enumeration. The Constitution, in its original form, had affixed no other limits to the power of Congress over the numbers of which the House of Representatives might consist than that there should not be more than one member for every 30,000 persons, but that each State should be entitled to at least one. Independent of the general considerations in favor of a more or less numerous representation in the popular branch of the legislature, there was one of a local nature whose operation, though secret, was extensive, which gave to this question a peculiar interest. To whatever number of persons a representative might be allotted, there would still remain a fraction, which would be greater or less in each state, according to the ratio which Congress should adopt between representation and population. The relative power of states in one branch of the legislature would consequently be affected by this ratio, and to questions of that description few members can permit themselves to be inattentive. This bill, as originally introduced into the House of Representatives, gave to each state one member for every 30,000 persons. On a motion to strike out the number 30,000, the debate turned chiefly on the policy and advantage of a more or less numerous House of Representatives. But with the general arguments suggested by the subject, strong and pointed allusions to the measures of the preceding Congress were interspersed, which indicated much more serious hostility to the administration than had hitherto been expressed. Speaking of the corruption which he supposed to exist in the British House of Commons, Mr. Giles said that causes essentially different from their numbers had produced this effect. Among these were the frequent mortgages of the funds and the immense appropriations at the disposal of the executive. An inequality of circumstances, he observed, produces revolutions in governments from democracy to aristocracy and monarchy. Great wealth produces a desire of distinctions, rank, and titles. The revolutions of property in this country have created a prodigious inequality of circumstances. Government has contributed to this inequality. The Bank of the United States is a most important machine in promoting the objects of this moneyed interest. This bank will be the most powerful engine to corrupt this House. Some of the members are directors of this institution, and it will only be by increasing the representation that an adequate barrier can be opposed to this moneyed interest. He next adverted to certain ideas which he said had been disseminated through the United States. The legislature, he took occasion to observe, ought to express some disapprobation of these opinions. The strong executive of this government, he added, ought to be balanced by a full representation in this House. Similar sentiments were advanced by Mr. Findley. After a long and animated discussion, the amendment was lost, and the bill passed in its original form. In the Senate, it was amended by changing the ratio so as to give one representative for every 33,000 persons in each state, but this amendment was disagreed to by the House of Representatives. And each House adhering to its opinion, the bill fell, but was again introduced into the House of Representatives under a different title and in a new form, though without any change in its substantial provisions. After a debate in which the injustice of the fractions produced by the ratio it adopted was strongly pressed, it passed that House. In the Senate it was again amended, not by reducing but by enlarging the number of representatives. The Constitution of the United States declares that representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this Union according to their respective numbers, and that the number of representatives shall not exceed one for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least one representative. Construing the Constitution to authorize a process by which the whole number of representatives should be ascertained on the whole population of the United States, and afterwards apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, the Senate applied the number 30,000 as a divisor to the total population, and taking the quotient, which was 120, as the number of representatives given by the ratio which had been adopted in the House where the bill had originated, they apportioned that number among the several states by that ratio, until as many representatives as it would give were allotted to each. The residuary members were then distributed among the states having the highest fractions. Without professing the principle on which this apportionment was made, the amendment of the Senate merely allotted to the states respectively the number of members which the process just mentioned would give. The result was a more equitable apportionment of representatives to population, and had the rule of construing that instrument been correct, the amendment removed objections which were certainly well founded, but the rule was novel and overturned opinions which had been generally assumed and were supposed to be settled. In one branch of the legislature it had already been rejected, and in the other the majority in its favor was only one. In the House of Representatives the amendment was supported with considerable ingenuity. After an earnest debate, however, it was disagreed to, and a conference took place without producing an accommodation among the members composing the committee. But finally the House of Representatives receded from their disagreement, and by a majority of 2 voices the bill passed as amended in the Senate. On the President the solemn duty of deciding whether an act of the legislature consisted with the Constitution, for the bill, if constitutional, was unexceptionable. In his cabinet also a difference of opinion is understood to have existed. The Secretary of State and the Attorney General were of opinion that the act was at variance with the Constitution. The Secretary of War was rather undecided, and the Secretary of the Treasury, thinking that, from the vagueness of expression in the clause relating to the subject, neither construction could be absolutely rejected, was in favor of acceding to the interpretation given by the legislature. After weighing the arguments which were urged on each side of the question, the President was confirmed in the opinion that the population of each State, and not the total population of the United States, must give the numbers to which alone the process by which the number of representatives was to be ascertained could be applied. Having formed this opinion to a correct and independent mind, the course to be pursued was a plain one. Duty required the exercise of a power which a President of the United States will always find much difficulty in employing, and he returned the bill to the House in which it originated, accompanied with his objections to it. In observance of the forms prescribed in the Constitution, the question was then taken on its passage by ayes and noes, and it was rejected. A 3rd bill was soon afterwards introduced, apportioning the representatives on the several States at a ratio of 1 for every 33,000 persons in each State, which passed into a law. Thus was this interesting part of the American Constitution finally settled. Militia law. During this session of Congress, an act passed for establishing a uniform militia. The President had manifested from the commencement of his administration a peculiar degree of solicitude on this subject, and had repeatedly urged it on Congress. In his speech at the opening of the present session, he again called the attention of the legislature to it, and at length a law was enacted which, though less efficacious than the plan reported by the Secretary of War, will probably not soon be carried into complete execution. Defeat of St. Clair. In December, intelligence was received by the President and immediately communicated to Congress that the American army had been totally defeated on the 4th of the preceding month. Although the most prompt and judicious measures had been taken to raise the troops and to march them to the frontiers, they could not be assembled in the neighborhood of Fort Washington until the month of September, nor was the establishment even then completed. The immediate objects of the expedition were to destroy the Indian villages on the Miamis, to expel the savages from that country, and to connect it with the Ohio by a chain of posts which would prevent their return during the war. On the 7th of September, the regulars moved from their camp in the vicinity of Fort Washington, and marching directly north towards the object of their destination, established 2 intermediate posts at the distance of rather more than 40 miles from each other as places of deposit and of security, either for convoys of provision which might follow the army, or for the army itself should any disaster befall it. The last of these works, Fort Jefferson, was not completed until the 24th of October, before which time reinforcements were received of about 360 militia. After placing garrisons in the forts, the effective number of the army, including militia, amounted to rather less than 2,000 men. With this force the general continued his march, which was rendered both slow and laborious by the necessity of opening a road. Small parties of Indians were frequently seen hovering about them, and some unimportant skirmishes took place. As the army approached the country in which they might expect to meet an enemy, about 60 of the militia deserted in a body. This diminution of force was not in itself an object of much concern, but there was reason to fear that the example, should those who set it be permitted to escape with impunity, would be extensively followed. And it was reported to be the intention of the deserters to plunder convoys of provisions which were advancing at some distance in the rear. To prevent mischiefs of so serious a nature, the general detached Major Hamtramck with the 1st Regiment in pursuit of the deserters, and directed him to secure the provisions under a strong guard. The army, consisting of about 1,400 effective rank and file, continued its march, and on the 3rd of November encamped about 15 miles south of the Miamis villages. The right wing, under the command of General Butler, formed the first line, and lay with a creek about 12 yards wide immediately in its front. The left wing, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Dark, formed the second, and between the 2 lines was an interval of about 70 yards. The right flank was supposed to be secured by the creek, by a steep bank, and by a small body of troops. The left was covered by a party of cavalry and by piquets. The militia crossed the creek and advanced about a quarter of a mile in front, where they also encamped in 2 lines. On their approach, a few Indians who had shown themselves on the opposite side of the creek fled with precipitation. At this place the general intended to throw up a slight work for the security of the baggage, and after being joined by Major Hamtramck, to march as unencumbered and as expeditiously as possible to the villages he proposed to destroy. In both these designs he was anticipated. About half an hour before sunrise the next morning, just after the troops had been dismissed from the parade, an unexpected attack was made upon the militia, who fled in the utmost confusion, and rushing into camp through the first line of Continental troops, which had been formed the instant the first gun was discharged, threw them too into disorder. The exertions of the officers to restore order were not entirely successful. The Indians pressed close upon the heels of the flying militia and engaged General Butler with great intrepidity. The action instantly became extremely warm, and the fire of the assailants, passing round both flanks of the first line, was in a few minutes poured with equal fury on the rear division. Its greatest weight was directed against the center of each wing, where the artillery was posted, and the artillerists were mowed down in great numbers. Firing from the ground and from the shelter which the woods afforded, the assailants were scarcely seen but when springing from one cover to another, in which manner they advanced close up to the American lines and to the very mouths of the field pieces. They fought with the daring courage of men whose trade is war, and who are stimulated by all those passions which can impel the savage mind to vigorous exertions. Under circumstances thus arduous, raw troops may be expected to exhibit that inequality which is found in human nature. While some of the American soldiers performed their duty with the utmost resolution, others seemed dismayed and terrified. Of this conduct the officers were, as usual, the victims. With the fearlessness which the occasion required, they exposed themselves to the most imminent dangers, and in their efforts to change the face of affairs fell in great numbers. For several days the commander-in-chief had been afflicted with a severe disease, under which he still labored, and which must have greatly affected him. But though unable to display that activity which would have been useful in this severe conflict, neither the feebleness of his body nor the peril of his situation could prevent his delivering his orders with judgment and with self-possession. It was soon perceived that the American fire could produce on a concealed enemy no considerable effect, and that the only hope of victory was placed in the bayonet. At the head of the 2nd Regiment, which formed the left of the left wing, Lieutenant Colonel Darke made an impetuous charge upon the enemy, forced them from their ground with some loss, and drove them about 400 yards. He was followed by that whole wing, but the want of a sufficient number of riflemen to press this advantage deprived him of the benefit which ought to have been derived from this effort, and as soon as he gave over the pursuit, the Indians renewed their attack. In the meantime General Butler was mortally wounded. The left of the right wing was broken, the artillerists almost to a man killed, the guns seized, and the camp penetrated by the enemy. With his own regiment, and with the battalions commanded by Majors Butler and Clark, Darke was ordered again to charge with the bayonet. These orders were executed with intrepidity and momentary success. The Indians were driven out of the camp, and the artillery recovered, but while they were pressed in one point by the bravest of the American troops, their fire was kept up from every other with fatal effect. Several times particular corps charged them, always with partial success, but no universal effort could be made, and in every charge a great loss of officers was sustained, the consequences of which were severely felt. Instead of keeping their ranks and executing the orders which were given, a great proportion of the soldiers flocked together in crowds and were shot down without resistance. To save the remnant of his army was all that remained to be done, and about 9:30 in the morning General St. Clair ordered Lieutenant Colonel Darke with the 2nd Regiment to charge a body of Indians who had intercepted their retreat, and to gain the road. Major Clark with his battalion was directed to cover the rear. These orders were executed, and a disorderly flight commenced. The pursuit was kept up about 4 miles, when, fortunately for the surviving Americans, that avidity for plunder which is a ruling passion among savages called back the victorious Indians to the camp, where the spoils of their vanquished foes were to be divided. The routed troops continued their flight to Fort Jefferson, a distance of about 30 miles, throwing away their arms on the road. At this place they met Major Hamtramck with the 1st Regiment, and a council of war was called to deliberate on the course to be pursued. As this regiment was far from restoring the strength of the morning, it was determined not to attempt to retrieve the fortune of the day, and leaving the wounded at Fort Jefferson, the army continued its retreat to Fort Washington. In this disastrous battle the loss on the part of the Americans was very great when compared with the numbers engaged. 38 commissioned officers were killed upon the field. and 593 non-commissioned officers and privates were slain and missing. 21 commissioned officers, several of whom afterwards died of their wounds, and 242 non-commissioned officers and privates were wounded. Among the dead was the brave and much lamented General Butler. This gallant officer had served through the War of the Revolution, and had on more than one occasion distinguished himself in a remarkable manner. In the list of those who shared his fate were the names of many other excellent officers who had participated in all the toils, the dangers, and the glory of that long conflict which terminated in the independence of their country. At the head of the list of wounded were Lieutenant Colonels Gibson and Dark, Major Butler, and Adjutant General Sargent, all of whom were veteran officers of great merit, who displayed their accustomed bravery on this unfortunate day. General St. Clair, in his official letter, observed, "The loss the public has sustained by the fall of so many officers, particularly of General Butler and Major Ferguson, cannot be too much regretted, but it is a circumstance that will alleviate the misfortune in some measure that all of them fell most gallantly doing their duty." From the weight of the fire and the circumstance of this being attacked nearly at the same time in front and rear, General St. Clair was of opinion that he was overpowered by numbers. The intelligence afterwards collected would make the Indian force to consist of from 1,000 to 1,500 warriors. Of their loss no estimate could be made. The probability is that it bore no proportion to that sustained by the American army. Nothing could be more unexpected than this severe disaster. The public had confidently anticipated a successful campaign, and could not believe that the general who had been unfortunate had not been culpable. 1792. The commander-in-chief requested with earnestness that a court-martial should sit on his conduct, but this request could not be granted, because the army did not furnish a sufficient number of officers of a grade to form a court for his trial on military principles. Late in the session, a committee of the House of Representatives was appointed to inquire into the cause of the failure of the expedition, whose report, in explicit terms, exculpated the commander-in-chief. This inquiry, however, was instituted rather for the purpose of investigating the conduct of civil than of military officers, and was not conducted by military men. More satisfactory testimony in favor of St. Clair is furnished by the circumstance that he still retained the undiminished esteem and good opinion of the President. The Indian War now assumed a still more serious aspect. There was reason to fear that the hostile tribes would derive a great accession of strength from the impression which their success would make upon their neighbors, and the reputation of the government was deeply concerned in retrieving the fortune of its arms and affording protections to its citizens. The President, therefore, lost no time in causing the estimates for a competent force to be prepared and laid before Congress. In conformity with a report made by the Secretary of War, a bill was brought into the House of Representatives directing 3 additional regiments of infantry and a squadron of cavalry to be raised, to serve for 3 years, if not sooner discharged. The whole military establishment, if completed, would amount to about 5,000 men. The additional regiments, however, were to be disbanded as soon as peace should be concluded with the Indians, and the President was authorized to discharge or to forbear to raise any part of them, in case events should, in his judgment, render his so doing consistent with the public safety. Opposition to the increase of the army. This bill met with great opposition. A motion was made to strike out the section which authorized an augmentation of force. By those who argued in favor of the motion, the justice of the war was arraigned, and the practicability of obtaining peace at a much less expense than would be incurred in its further prosecution was urged with vehemence. An extension of the present frontier was said not to be desirable, and if the citizens of the United States were recalled within their proper boundaries, hostilities would cease. At any rate, it was an idle waste of blood and treasure to carry the war beyond the line of forts already established. It was only exposing their arms to disgrace, betraying their own weakness, and lessening the public confidence in the government to send forth armies to be butchered in the forests, while the British were suffered to keep possession of posts within the territory of the United States. To this cause was to be ascribed any disposition which might exist on the part of the Indians to continue hostilities, and to its removal the efforts of the government ought to be directed. But admitting the war to have been just in its commencement, and its continuance to be required by the honor and interest of the nation, yet as an invasion of the Indian country ought not to be attempted, this augmentation of the military establishment could not be necessary. Regular troops could only be useful as garrisons for posts to which the militia might resort for protection or supplies. Experience had proved that the sudden desultory attacks of the frontier militia and rangers were productive of more valuable consequences than the methodical operations of a regular force. But should it even be conceded that invasion and conquest were to be contemplated, the existing establishment, if completed, would be sufficiently great, and it was still insisted that even for the purposes of conquest, the frontier militia were superior to any regulars whatever. The expense of such an army as the bill contemplated was said to be an object worthy of serious attention, and members were requested to observe the progress of this business and to say where it would stop. At first only a single regiment had been raised, and the expense was about $100,000. A second was afterwards added, which swelled the expense to $300,000, and now a standing force of 5,168 men is contemplated at an annual expense of above $1,250,000. They were preparing to squander away money by millions, and no one, except those who were in the secrets of the cabinet, knew why the war had been thus carried on for 3 years. Against the motion for striking out, it was urged that the justice of the war could not be questioned by any man who would allow that self-preservation and indispensable necessity could furnish sufficient motives for taking up arms. It was proved by unquestionable documents that from the year 1783 to 1790 there had been not less than 1,500 persons, either the inhabitants of Kentucky or emigrants on their way to that country, who had been massacred by the savages or dragged into captivity, and there was reason to believe that on the frontiers of Virginia and of Pennsylvania the murdered and the prisoners would furnish a list almost equally numerous. The conciliatory disposition of the government was stated, and its repeated efforts to obtain a peace were enumerated. It was particularly observed that in 1790, when a treaty was proposed at the Miamis villages, the Indians at first refused to retreat. They next required 30 days to deliberate. This request was acceded to, and in the interim offensive operations were expressly prohibited by the President. Yet notwithstanding this forbearance on the part of the whites, not less than 120 persons were killed and captured by the savages, and several prisoners were roasted alive during that short period, at the expiration of which the Indians refused to give any answer to the proposition which had been made to them. But it was now too late to inquire into the justice of the principles on which the war was originally undertaken. The nation was involved in it, and could not recede without exposing many innocent persons to be butchered by the enemy. Should the government determine to discontinue the war, would the Indians also consent to a cessation of hostilities? The government could not, without impeachment both of its justice and humanity, abandon the inhabitants of the frontiers to the rage of their savage enemies. And although the excise might be unpopular, although money might still be wanted, what was the excise, what was money when put in competition with the lives of their friends and brethren? A sufficient force must be raised for their defense, and the only question was what that force should be. The calculations of the best informed men were in favor of employing an army not inferior to that proposed in the bill. When the known attachment of Indians to war and plunder was adverted to, and the excitements to that attachment, which were furnished by the trophies acquired in the last 2 campaigns, were considered, no man would venture to pronounce with confidence how extensive the combination against the United States might become, or what numbers they would have to encounter. It only behooved them to prepare in time for a much more vigorous effort than had hitherto been made. The objections drawn from the increased expense which such an effort would require must entirely vanish before the eyes of any man who looks forward to the consequences of another unsuccessful campaign. Such a disaster would eventually involve the nation in much greater expense than that which is now made the ground of opposition. Better, therefore, is it to make at once a vigorous and effectual exertion to bring the contest to a close, than to continue gradually draining the Treasury by dragging on the war and renewing hostility from year to year. The supporters of the bill also appealed to experience for the superiority of regular troops over militia in accomplishing all the purposes, even of Indian war, and those arguments were urged in favor of this theory, which this subject readily suggests. The motion for striking out this section was lost, and the bill was carried for the augmentation of force required by the Executive. The Treasury was not in a condition to meet the demands upon it which the increased expenses of the war would unavoidably occasion, and sources of additional revenue were to be explored. A select committee to whom this subject was referred brought in a resolution directing the Secretary of the Treasury to report his opinion to the House on the best mode of raising those additional supplies which the public service might require for the current year. This proposition gave rise to a very animated debate. It will be recollected that when the act for establishing the Treasury Department was under consideration, the clause which rendered it the duty of the Secretary to digest and report plans for the improvement and management of the revenue and for the support of public credit was earnestly opposed. A large majority, however, was in favor of the principle, and after being so modified as only to admit a report if required by the House, it was retained in the bill. In complying with the various resolutions of Congress calling for reports on subjects connected with his department, the Secretary had submitted plans which, having been profoundly considered, were well digested and accompanied by arguments the force of which it was difficult to resist. His measures were generally supported by a majority of Congress, and while the high credit of the United States was believed to attest their wisdom, the masterly manner in which his reports were drawn contributed to raise still higher that reputation for great talents which he had long possessed. To the further admission of these reports it was determined on this occasion to make a vigorous resistance. But the opposition was not successful. On taking the question, the resolution was carried, 31 members voting in its favor and 27 against it. End of Chapter 7, Part 1. Chapter 7, Part 2 of The Life of Washington, Volume 4, by John Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7, Part 2, Report of the Secretary of the Treasury for raising additional supplies. The report made by the Secretary in pursuance of this resolution recommended certain augmentations of the duties on imports, and was immediately referred to the consideration of a committee of the whole House. Resolutions were then passed which were to form the basis of a bill, and which adopted not only the principles, but, with the exception of a few unimportant alterations, the minute details of the report. Before the question was taken on the bill, a motion was made to limit its duration, the vote upon which strongly marked the progress of opinion in the House respecting those systems of finance which were believed to have established the credit of the United States. The Secretary of the Treasury had deemed it indispensable to the creation of public credit that the appropriations of funds for the payment of the interest and the gradual redemption of the principal of the national debt should be not only sufficient but permanent also. A party was found in the first Congress who opposed this principle and were in favor of retaining a full power over the subject in each branch of the legislature by making annual appropriations. The arguments which had failed in Congress appear to have been more successfully employed with the people. Among the multiplied vices which were ascribed to the funding system, it was charged with introducing a permanent and extensive mortgage of funds, which was alleged to strengthen unduly the hands of the executive magistrate, and to be one of the many evidences which existed of monarchical propensities in those who administered the government. The report lately made by the Secretary of the Treasury, and the bill founded on that report, contemplated a permanent increase of the duties on certain specified articles, and a permanent appropriation of the revenue arising from them to the purposes of the national debt. 31 members were in favor of the motion for limiting the duration of the bill, and only 30 against it. By the rules of the House, the Speaker has a right first to vote as a member, and if the numbers should then be equally divided, to decide as Speaker. Being opposed to the limitation, the motion was lost by his voice. On the 8th of May, after an active and interesting session, Congress adjourned to the first Monday in November. The asperity which on more than one occasion discovered itself in debate was a certain index of the growing exasperation of parties, and the strength of the opposition on those questions which brought into review the points on which the administration was to be attacked denoted the impression which the specific charges brought against those who conducted public affairs had made on the minds of the people in an extensive division of the continent. It may conduce to a more perfect understanding of subsequent transactions to present in this place a sketch of those charges. Strictures on the conduct of administration with a view of parties. It was alleged that the public debt was too great to be paid before other causes of adding to it would occur. This accumulation of debt had been artificially produced by the assumption of what was due from the states. Its immediate effect was to deprive the government of its power over those easy sources of revenue which, applied to its ordinary necessities and exigencies, would have answered them habitually, and thereby have avoided those burdens on the people which occasioned such murmurs against taxes and tax-gatherers. As a consequence of it, although the calls for money had not been greater than must be expected for the same or equivalent exigencies, yet Congress had been already obliged not only to strain the impost until it produced clamor and would produce evasion and war on their own citizens to collect it, but even to resort to an excise law of odious character with the people, partial in its operation, unproductive unless enforced by arbitrary and vexatious means, and committing the authority of the government in parts where resistance was most probable and coercion least practicable. That the United States, if left free to act at their discretion, might borrow at 2/3 of the interest contracted to be paid to the public creditors, and thus discharge themselves from the principal in 2/3 of the time. But from this they were precluded by the irredeemable quality of the debt, a quality given for the avowed purpose of inviting its transfer to foreign countries. This transfer of the principal, when completed, would occasion an exportation of $3 millions annually for the interest, a drain of coin without example, and of the consequences of which no calculation could be made. The banishment of coin would be completed by 10 millions of paper money in the form of bank bills, which were then issuing into circulation. Nor would this be the only mischief resulting from the institution of the bank. The 10 or 12% annual profit paid to the lenders of this paper medium would take out of the pockets of the people who would have had, without interest, the coin it was banishing. That all the capital employed in paper speculation is barren and useless, producing, like that on a gaming table, no accession to itself, and is withdrawn from commerce and agriculture, where it would have produced addition to the common mass. The wealth, therefore, heaped upon the individuals by the funding and banking systems would be productive of general poverty and distress. That in addition to the encouragement these measures gave to vice and idleness, they had furnished effectual means of corrupting such a portion of the legislature as turned the balance between the honest voters. This corrupt squad, deciding the voice of the legislature, had manifested their dispositions to get rid of the limitations imposed by the Constitution, limitations on the faith of which the states acceded to that instrument. They were proceeding rapidly in their plan of absorbing all power, invading the rights of the states, and converting the federal into a consolidated government. That the ultimate object of all this was to prepare the way for a change from the present republican form of government to that of a monarchy, of which the English Constitution was to be the model. So many of the friends of monarchy were in the legislature that, aided by the corrupt squad of paper dealers who were at their devotion, they made a majority in both houses. The Republican party, even when united with the Anti-Federalists, continued a minority. But all of the mischiefs resulting from the system of measures which was so much reprobated, none was so afflicting, so fatal to every honest hope, as the corruption of the legislature. As it was the earliest of these measures, it became the instrument for producing the rest, and would be the instrument for producing in future a king, lords, and commons, or whatever else those who directed it might choose. Withdrawn such a distance from the eye of their constituents, they would form the most corrupt government on earth, if the means of their corruption were not prevented. These strictures on the conduct of administration were principally directed against measures which had originated with the Secretary of the Treasury, and had afterwards received the sanction of the legislature. In the southern division of the continent, that officer was unknown, except to a few military friends, and to those who had engaged in the legislative or executive departments of the former or present government. His systems of revenue having been generally opposed by the Southern members, and the original opposition to the Constitution having been particularly great in Virginia and North Carolina, the aspersions on his views, and on the views of the Eastern members by whom his plans had been generally supported, were seldom controverted. The remote tendency of particular systems and the motives for their adoption are so often subjects of conjecture, that the judgment, when exercised upon them, is peculiarly exposed to the influence of the passions, and where measures are in themselves burdensome, and the necessity for their adoption has not been appreciated, suspicions of their unknown advocates can seldom be unsuccessfully urged by persons in whom the people have placed their confidence. It is not, therefore, cause of astonishment that the dark motives ascribed to the authors of tax laws should be extensively believed. Throughout the United States, the party opposed to the Constitution had charged its supporters with a desire to establish a monarchy on the ruins of republican government, and the Constitution itself was alleged to contain principles which would prove the truth of this charge. The leaders of the party had therefore been ready from the instant the government came into operation to discover in all its measures those monarchical tendencies which they had perceived in the instrument they opposed. The salaries allowed to public officers, though so low as not to afford a decent maintenance to those who resided at the seat of government, were declared to be so enormously high as clearly to manifest a total disregard of that simplicity and economy which were the characteristics of republics. The levees of the President and the evening parties of Mrs. Washington were said to be imitations of regal institutions designed to accustom the American people to the pomp and manners of European courts. The Vice President, too, was said to keep up the state and dignity of a monarch and to illustrate by his conduct the principles which were inculcated in his political works. The Indian War, they alleged, was misconducted and unnecessarily prolonged for the purposes of expending the public money and of affording a pretext for augmenting the military establishment and increasing the revenue. All this prodigal waste of the money of the people was designed to keep up the national debt and the influence it gave the government, which, united with standing armies and immense revenues, would enable their rulers to rivet the chains which they were secretly forging. Every prediction which had been uttered respecting the anti-republican principles of the government was said to be rapidly verifying, and that which was disbelieved as prophecy was daily becoming history. If a remedy for these ills was not found in the increased representation of the people which would take place at the ensuing elections, they would become too monstrous to be borne, and when it was recollected that the division of opinion was marked by a geographical line, there was reason to fear that the Union would be broken into one or more confederacies. These irritable symptoms had assumed appearances of increased malignity during the session of Congress which had just terminated, and to the President, who firmly believed that the Union and the liberty of the States depended on the preservation of the government, they were the more unpleasant and the more alarming because they were displayed in full force in his cabinet. Disagreement between the Secretaries of State and Treasury. Between the Secretaries of the State and Treasury Departments, a disagreement existed which seems to have originated in an early stage of the administration, and to have acquired a regular accession of strength from circumstances which were perpetually occurring until it grew into open and irreconcilable hostility. Without tracing this disagreement to those motives which in elective governments especially often produce enmities between distinguished personages, neither of whom acknowledges the superiority of the other, such radical differences of opinion on points which would essentially influence the course of the government were supposed to exist between the secretaries as in a great measure to account for this unextinguishable enmity. These differences of opinion were perhaps to be ascribed in some measure to a difference in the original structure of their minds, and in some measure to the difference of the situations in which they had been placed. Until near the close of the war, Mr. Hamilton had served his country in the field, and just before its termination had passed from the camp into Congress, where he remained for some time after peace had been established. In the former station, the danger to which the independence of his country was exposed from the imbecility of the government was perpetually before his eyes, and in the latter his attention was forcibly directed towards the loss of its reputation and the sacrifice of its best interests, which were to be ascribed to the same cause. Mr. Hamilton, therefore, was the friend of a government which should possess in itself sufficient powers and resources to maintain the character and defend the integrity of the nation. Having long felt and witnessed the mischiefs produced by the absolute sovereignty of the states, and by the control which they were enabled and disposed separately to exercise over every measure of general concern, he was particularly apprehensive of danger from that quarter, which he probably believed was to be the more dreaded because the habits and feelings of the American people were calculated to inspire state rather than national prepossessions. Under the influence of these impressions, he is understood to have avowed opinions in the convention favorable to a system in which the executive and senate, though elective, were to be rather more permanent than they were rendered in that which was actually proposed. He afterwards supported the Constitution as framed with great ability, and contributed essentially to its adoption, but he still retained and openly avowed the opinion that the greatest hazards to which it was exposed arose from its weakness, and that American liberty and happiness had much more to fear from the encroachments of the great states than from those of the general government. Mr. Jefferson had retired from Congress before the depreciation of the currency had produced an entire dependence of the general on the local governments, after which he filled the highest offices in the state of which he was a citizen. About the close of the war he was reelected to Congress, but being soon afterwards employed on a mission to the court of Versailles, where he remained while the people of France were taking the first steps of that immense revolution which has astonished and agitated 2/4 of the world. In common with all his countrymen, he felt a strong interest in favor of the reformers, and it is not unreasonable to suppose that while residing in that court, and associating with those who meditated some of the great events which have since taken place, his mind might be warmed with the abuses of the monarchy which were perpetually in his view, and he might be led to the opinion that liberty could sustain no danger but from the executive power. Mr. Jefferson therefore seems to have entertained no apprehensions from the debility of the government, no jealousy of the state sovereignties, and no suspicion of their encroachments. His fears took a different direction, and all his precautions were used to check and limit the exercise of the powers vested in the government of the United States. Neither could he perceive danger to liberty except from that government, and especially from the executive department. He did not feel so sensibly as those who had continued in the United States the necessity of adopting the Constitution, and had at one time avowed a wish that it might be rejected by such a number of states as would secure certain alterations which he thought essential. His principal objections seem to have been the want of a Bill of Rights and the re-eligibility of the President. From this opinion, however, in favor of a partial rejection, he is understood to have receded, after seeing the plan pursued by the Convention of Massachusetts and followed by other states, which was to adopt unconditionally and to annex the recommendation of the amendments which were desired. To these causes of division another was superadded, the influence of which was soon felt in all the political transactions of the government. The war, which was terminated in 1783, had left in the bosoms of the American people a strong attachment to France and enmity to Great Britain. These feelings, in a greater or less degree, were perhaps universal, and had been prevented from subsiding by circumstances to which allusions have already been made. They had evinced themselves in the state legislatures by commercial regulations, and were demonstrated by all those means by which the public sentiment is usually displayed. They found their way also into the national councils, where they manifested themselves in the motions respecting the favors which ought to be shown to nations having commercial treaties with the United States. Although affection for France and jealousy of Britain were sentiments common to the people of America, the same unanimity did not exist respecting the influence which ought to be allowed to those sentiments over the political conduct of the nation. While many favored such discriminations as might eventually turn the commerce of the United States into new channels, others maintained that on this subject equality ought to be observed, that trade ought to be guided by the judgment of individuals, and that no sufficient motives existed for that sacrifice of general and particular interests which was involved in the discriminations proposed, discriminations which, in their view, amounted to a tax on American agriculture and a bounty on the navigation and manufactures of a favored foreign nation. The former opinion was taken up with warmth by the Secretary of State, and the latter was adopted with equal sincerity by the Secretary of the Treasury. This contrariety of sentiment respecting commercial regulation was only a part of a general system. It extended itself to all the relations which might subsist between America and those two great powers. In all popular governments, the press is the most ready channel by which the opinions and the passions of the few are communicated to the many, and of the press the two great parties forming in the United States sought to avail themselves. The Gazette of the United States supported the systems of the Treasury Department, while other papers enlisted themselves under the banners of the opposition. Conspicuous among these was the National Gazette, a paper edited by a clerk in the Department of State. The avowed purpose for which the Secretary patronized this paper was to present to the eye of the American people European intelligence derived from the Leyden Gazette instead of English papers. But it soon became the vehicle of calumny against the funding and banking systems, against the duty on home-made spirits, which was denominated an excise, and against the men who had proposed and supported those measures. With perhaps equal asperity, the papers attached to the party which had defended these systems assailed the motives of the leaders of the opposition. Letters from Washington on the subject. This schism in his cabinet was a subject of extreme mortification to the President. Entertaining a high respect for the talents, and a real esteem for the characters of both gentlemen, he was unwilling to part with either, and exerted all the influence he possessed to effect a reconciliation between them. In a letter of the 23rd of August, addressed to the Secretary of State, after reviewing the critical situation of the United States with respect to its external relations, he thus expressed himself on this delicate subject: "How unfortunate, and how much is it to be regretted, then, that, while we are encompassed on all sides with avowed enemies and insidious friends, internal dissension should be harassing and tearing our vitals. The last, to me, is the most serious, the most alarming, and the most afflicting of the two, and without more charity for the opinions of one another in governmental matters, or some more infallible criterion, by which the truth of speculative opinions, before they have undergone the test of experience, are to be forejudged, than has yet fallen to the lot of fallibility, I believe it will be difficult, if not impracticable, to manage the reins of government, or to keep the parts of it together. For if, instead of laying our shoulders to the machine, after measures are decided on, one pulls this way and another that, before the utility of the thing is fairly tried, it must inevitably be torn asunder, and in my opinion the fairest prospect of happiness and prosperity that ever was presented to man will be lost, perhaps for ever. My earnest wish and my fondest hope, therefore, is, that instead of wounding suspicions and irritating charges, there may be liberal allowances, mutual forbearances, and temporizing yielding on all sides. Under the exercise of these, matters will go on smoothly, and, if possible, more prosperously. Without them everything must rub, the wheels of government will clog, our enemies will triumph, and by throwing their weight into the disaffected scale, may accomplish the ruin of the goodly fabric we have been erecting. I do not mean to apply this advice or these observations to any particular person or character. I have given them in the same general terms to other officers of the government, because the disagreements which have arisen from difference of opinions, and the attacks which have been made upon almost all the measures of government and most of its executive officers, have for a long time past filled me with painful sensations, and cannot fail, I think, of producing unhappy consequences at home and abroad. In a subsequent letter to the same gentleman, in answer to one which enclosed some documents designed to prove that, though desirous of amending the Constitution, he had favored its adoption, the President said: "I did not require the evidence of the extracts which you enclosed me to convince me of your attachment to the Constitution of the United States, or of your disposition to promote the general welfare of this country, but I regret, deeply regret, the difference of opinion which has arisen, and divided you and another principal officer of the government, and wish devoutly there could be an accommodation of them by mutual yieldings. A measure of this sort would produce harmony and consequent good in our public councils, and the contrary will inevitably produce confusion and serious mischiefs. And for what? Because mankind cannot think alike, but would adopt different means to attain the same end. For I will frankly and solemnly declare that I believe the views of both to be pure and well meant, and that experience only will decide with respect to the salubrity of the measures which are the subjects of this dispute. Why then, when some of the best citizens of the United States, men of discernment, uniform and tried patriots, who have no sinister views to promote, but are chaste in their ways of thinking and acting, are to be found, some on one side and some on the other, of the questions which have caused these agitations, why should either of you be so tenacious of your opinions as to make no allowance for those of the other?" I could, and indeed was about to add more on this interesting subject, but will forbear, at least for the present, after expressing a wish that the cup which has been presented to us may not be snatched from our lips by a discordance of action, when I am persuaded there is no discordance in your views. I have a sincere esteem and regard for you both, and ardently wish that some line could be marked out by which both of you could walk. These earnest endeavors to soothe the angry passions and to conciliate the jarring discords of the cabinet were unsuccessful. The hostility which was so much and so sincerely lamented sustained no diminution, and its consequences became every day more diffusive. Among the immediate effects of these internal dissensions was the encouragement they afforded to a daring and criminal resistance, which was made to the execution of the laws imposing a duty on spirits distilled within the United States. To the inhabitants of that part of Pennsylvania which lies west of the Alleghany Mountains, this duty was from local considerations peculiarly odious, nor was their hostility to the measure diminished by any affection for the source in which it originated. The Constitution itself had encountered the most decided opposition from that part of the state, and that early enmity to the government which exerted every faculty to prevent its adoption had sustained no abatement. Its measures generally, and the whole system of finance particularly, had been reprobated with peculiar bitterness by many of the most popular men of that district. With these dispositions, a tax law, the operation of which was extended to them, could not be favorably received, however generally it might be supported in other parts of the Union. But when to this pre-existing temper were superadded the motives which arose from perceiving that the measure was censured on the floor of Congress as unnecessary and tyrannical, that resistance to its execution was treated as probable, that a powerful and active party pervading the Union arraigned with extreme acrimony the whole system of finance as being hostile to liberty, and with all the passionate vehemence of conviction charged its advocates with designing to subvert the republican institutions of America, we ought not to be surprised that the awful impressions which usually restrain combinations to resist the laws were lessened, and that the malcontents were emboldened to hope that those combinations might be successful. Opposition to the excise law. Some discontents have been manifested in several parts of the Union on the first introduction of the act, but the prudence and firmness of the government and its officers had dissipated them, and the law had been carried into general operation. But in the western district of Pennsylvania, the resistance wore the appearance of system and was regularly progressive. In its commencement, it manifested itself by the circulation of opinions calculated to increase the odium in which the duty was held, and by endeavors to defeat its collection by directing the public resentments against those who were inclined either to comply with the law or to accept the offices through which it was to be executed. These indications of ill temper were succeeded by neighborhood meetings in which resolutions of extreme violence were adopted, and by acts of outrage against the persons of revenue officers. At length, in September 1791, a meeting of delegates from the malcontent counties was held at Pittsburgh, in which resolutions were adopted breathing the same spirit with those which had previously been agreed to in county assemblies. Unfortunately, the deputy marshal who was entrusted with the process against those who had committed acts of violence on the persons of revenue officers was so intimidated by the turbulent spirit which was generally displayed that he returned without performing his duty, and thus added to the confidence felt by the disaffected in their strength. Appearances were such as to justify apprehensions that the judiciary would be found unable to punish the violators of the laws, and the means of obtaining aid from the executive had not been furnished by the legislature. This state of things was the more embarrassing because the prejudices which had been widely disseminated, and the misconceptions of the act which had been extensively diffused, authorized some fears respecting the support which the law, while yet in the infancy of its operation, would receive from the people. These considerations, added to that repugnance which was felt by the government to the employment of harsh means, induced a forbearance to notice further these riotous proceedings until the measure, by being carried into full effect in other parts of the Union, should be better understood, and until Congress should assemble and modify the system in such a manner as to remove any real objections to it, the existence of which might be suggested by experience. Accordingly, in the legislature which convened in October 1791, this subject was taken up in pursuance of the recommendation of the President, and an amendatory act was passed in May 1792, in which the whole system was revised, and great pains were taken to alter such parts of it as could be deemed exceptionable. This conciliatory measure did not produce the desired effect. No abatement took place in the violence and outrage with which the resistance to the law was conducted. To carry it into execution, officers of inspection were necessary in every county. The malcontents for a considerable time deterred every person from consenting to permit an office to be held at his house. And when at length this difficulty was supposed to be overcome, those who had been prevailed on to accede to the propositions of the supervisor in this respect were compelled by personal violence and by threats of the destruction of property and even of death to retract the consent they had given. A meeting was again convened at Pittsburgh, in which, among other very exceptionable resolutions, committees were established to correspond with any committees of a similar nature that might be appointed in other parts of the United States. By this meeting it was declared that they would persist in every legal measure to obstruct the execution of the law, and would consider those who held offices for the collection of the duty as unworthy of their friendship, that they would have no intercourse or dealings with them, would withdraw from them every assistance, and withhold all the comforts of life which depend upon those duties which, as men and fellow citizens, they owed to each other, and would upon all occasions treat them with contempt. It was at the same time earnestly recommended to the people at large to adopt the same line of conduct. President's proclamation. No man could be more sensible than the President of the dangerous tendency of these measures, nor more indignant at the outrage thus offered to the government of the United States. But his prudence and his high respect for the laws restrained him within the narrow limits which the legislature had prescribed. A proclamation was issued, exhorting and admonishing all persons to desist from any combinations or proceedings whatsoever tending to obstruct the execution of the laws, and requiring the interference of the civil magistrate, and prosecutions against the offenders were directed to be instituted in every case in which they could be supported. This proclamation produced no salutary effect. Many of the civil magistrates were themselves concerned in stimulating the excesses they were required to suppress, and those who had not embarked in the criminal enterprise found themselves totally unable to maintain the sovereignty of the laws. With a laudable solicitude to avoid extremities, the government still sought for means to recall these misguided people to a sense of duty without the employment of a military force. To obtain this desirable object, the following system was digested and pursued. Prosecutions were instituted against delinquents in those cases in which it was believed that they could be maintained. The spirits distilled in the non-complying counties were intercepted on their way to market and seized by the officers of the revenue, and the agents for the army were directed to purchase only those spirits on which the duty had been paid. By thus acting on the interests of the distillers, the hope was indulged that they might be induced to comply with the law. Could they have obeyed their wishes, these measures would have produced the desired effect, but they were no longer masters of their own conduct. Impelled by a furious multitude, they found it much more dangerous to obey the laws than to resist them. The efficacy of this system, too, was diminished by a circumstance which induced the necessity of a second application to the legislature. The act had not been extended to the territory northwest of the Ohio, in which great part of the army lay, and the distillers eluded the vigilance of the government by introducing their spirits into that territory. While from causes which were incessant and active in their operations, some of which seemed too strongly fixed in the human mind ever to be removed, a broad foundation was thus laid for those party struggles whose fury is generally proportioned to the magnitude of the objects to be attained, and to the means which may be employed in attaining them. The external affairs of the United States sustained no material change. Of the good understanding which was preserved with France, a fresh proof had been recently given by the employment of Mr. Ternan, a person peculiarly acceptable to the American government, to succeed the Count de Moustier as Minister Plenipotentiary of His Most Christian Majesty. And in turn Mr. Governor Morris, who was understood to have rendered himself agreeable to the French government, was appointed to represent the United States at the court of Versailles. In addition to these interchanges of civility, a melancholy occasion had presented itself for giving much more substantial evidence of the alacrity with which the American administration would embrace any proper opportunity of manifesting its disposition to promote the interests of France. End of Chapter 7, Part 2. Chapter 7, Part 3 of the Life of Washington, Volume 4, by John Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7, Part 3. Insurrection and Massacre in the Island of San Domingo. Early and bitter fruits of that malignant philosophy, which, disregarding the actual state of the world, and estimating at nothing the miseries of a vast portion of the human race, can coolly and deliberately pursue, through oceans of blood, abstract systems for the attainment of some fancied untried good, were gathered in the French West Indies. Instead of proceeding in the correction of any abuses which might exist, by those slow and cautious steps which gradually introduce reform without ruin, which may prepare and fit society for that better state of things designed for it, and which, by not attempting impossibilities, may enlarge the circle of happiness, the revolutionists of France formed the mad and wicked project of spreading their doctrines of equality among persons between whom distinctions and prejudices exist, to be subdued only by the grave. The rage excited by the pursuit of this visionary and baneful theory, after many threatening symptoms, burst forth on the 23rd day of August, 1791, with a fury alike destructive and general. In one night a preconcerted insurrection of the blacks took place throughout the colony of San Domingo, and the white inhabitants of the country, while sleeping in their beds, were involved in one indiscriminate massacre from which neither age nor sex could afford an exemption. Only a few females, reserved for a fate more cruel than death, were intentionally spared, and not many were fortunate enough to escape into the fortified cities. The insurgents then assembled in vast numbers, and a bloody war commenced between them and the whites inhabiting the towns. The whole French part of the island was in imminent danger of being totally lost to the mother country. The minister of His Most Christian Majesty applied to the executive of the United States for a sum of money which would enable him to preserve this valuable colony, to be deducted out of the debt to his sovereign, and the request was granted in a manner evincing the interest taken by the administration in whatever might concern France. On the part of Spain, a desire had been expressed to adjust the subjects in controversy between the two nations by negotiations to be carried on at Madrid, and Mr. Carmichael and Mr. Short had been appointed commissioners with powers equal to the object. In the meantime, the officers of that nation persisted in measures which were calculated to embroil the United States with the Southern Indians. By their intrigues with the Creeks, the treaty formed in 1790 with McGillivray was prevented from being ratified, and the boundary line then agreed upon was not permitted to be run. The indefinite claim of territory set up by Spain was alleged to constitute a sufficient objection to any new line of demarcation until that claim should be settled, and her previous treaties and relations with the Creeks were declared to be infringed by their stipulation, acknowledging themselves to be under the protection of the United States. An official diplomatic intercourse had at length been opened with Great Britain also. Mr. Hammond, the minister plenipotentiary of that nation to the United States, arrived at Philadelphia in the autumn of 1791, upon which Mr. Thomas Pinckney, a gentleman of South Carolina, who was highly and justly respected, had been charged with the interests of his country at the court of London. Soon after the arrival of Mr. Hammond, the non-execution of the Treaty of Peace became the subject of a correspondence between him and the Secretary of State, in which the complaints of their respective nations were urged, manifesting clearly the sense entertained by each of the justice of those complaints, without furnishing solid ground for the hope that they would be immediately removed on either side. Mr. Hammond's powers on the subject of a commercial treaty were far from being satisfactory. To the inquiries of Mr. Jefferson on this point, he replied that he was authorized to enter into a negotiation respecting the commercial intercourse between the two countries, and to discuss those principles which might serve as a basis for a treaty, but not to conclude any definitive arrangements. In fact, there was much reason to believe that the obstacles to a commercial treaty between the two countries would not be soon or easily surmounted. In America, such an alteration in the law of nations as would permit the goods of an enemy to pass freely in the bottom of a neutral was a favorite project, and a full participation of the colonial trade was also most earnestly desired. That the latter of these objects would not be readily conceded by Great Britain did not admit of a doubt, but many intelligent men possessing great political influence had embraced the opinion that she could be forced out of that colonial system which every European power having settlements in America had adopted, by regulations restricting her navigation and commerce with the United States. To those who entertained this opinion, no commercial treaty could be acceptable which did not contain the concessions they required. In addition to a general knowledge of the sentiments of the British Cabinet on these points, particular evidence had lately been received of its positive decision respecting them. A comprehensive report on American affairs had been made to the Privy Council by a committee of that body, which was laid before the King. A few copies of it had been printed for the members of the Cabinet, which were soon called in by a sudden order of council, but one of these copies was obtained and transmitted to the Secretary of State of the United States. This report manifested a willingness to form a commercial treaty with the American government on principles of perfect equality, both with respect to navigation and commerce, so far as regarded the dominions of His Britannic Majesty in Europe. But it also discovered a determination to adhere inflexibly to the existing regulations for the colonies, and to reject the principle that free bottoms make free goods. In this state paper, the opinion was advanced that several important articles of exportation from the United States, especially tobacco, had been peculiarly favored in Great Britain, but that these friendly regulations were not reciprocated by America. The means of retaliating injuries which might be inflicted on British commerce were stated, but those means, it was said, ought not hastily to be adopted, the more especially as the existing government of the United States had discovered dispositions more favorable to a liberal and fair intercourse between the two countries than had been manifested by the respective states. For several reasons it was deemed advisable not suddenly to disturb the existing state of things, but to regulate the trade of the two nations by a treaty, the stipulations of which should be equal and mutually beneficial, provided such a treaty could be formed without a departure from those principles which were considered as fundamental. General Wayne appointed to the command of the army. No abatement of hostility having taken place among the northwestern Indians, the preparations for terminating the war by the sword were earnestly pressed. Major General Wayne was appointed to succeed General St. Clair, who resigned the command of the army, and the utmost exertions were made to complete it to the establishment. But the laws furnished such small inducements to engage in the service that the highest military grades, next to that of commander-in-chief, were declined by many to whom they were offered, and the recruiting business advanced too slowly to authorize a hope that the decisive expedition which was meditated could be prudently undertaken in the course of the present year. Meanwhile, the public clamor against the war continued to be loud and violent. It was vehemently asserted that if the intentions of the government respecting the savages were just and humane, those intentions were unknown to them, and that their resentments were kept up by the aggressions of whites, and by the opinion that their expulsion from the country they occupied was the object of the hostilities carried on against them. However satisfied the President might be of the fallacy of these opinions, they were too extensively maintained not to be respected as far as was compatible with a due regard to the real interests of the nation. While, therefore, the preparations for offensive operations were hastened by a vigorous exertion of the means at the disposal of the executive, it was thought advisable to make another effort to terminate the war by a direct communication of the pacific views of the United States. The failure of these attempts was still less to be lamented than the fate of those who were employed in them. Colonel Hardin and Major Truman, two brave officers and valuable men, were severally dispatched with propositions of peace, and each was murdered by the savages. Meeting of Congress, President's speech. On the 5th of November, Congress again convened. In the speech delivered at the commencement of the session, Indian affairs were treated at considerable length, and the continuance of the war was mentioned as a subject of much regret. The reiterated endeavors, it was said, which had been made to effect a pacification had hitherto issued in new and outrageous proofs of persevering hostility on the part of the tribes with whom the United States were in contest. A detail of the measures that had been pursued and of their consequences, which would be laid before Congress, while it would confirm the want of success thus far, would evince that means as proper and as efficacious as could have been devised had been employed. The issue of some of them was still pending, but a favorable one, though not to be despaired of, was not promised by anything that had yet happened. That a sanction commonly respected even among savages had been found insufficient to protect from massacre the emissaries of peace was particularly noticed, and the families of those valuable citizens who had thus fallen victims to their zeal for the public service were recommended to the attention of the legislature. That unprovoked aggression had been made by the Southern Indians, and that there was just cause for apprehension that the war would extend to them also, was mentioned as a subject of additional concern. Every practicable exertion had been made to be prepared for the alternative of prosecuting the war in the event of a failure of pacific overtures. A large proportion of the troops authorized to be raised had been recruited, though the numbers were yet incomplete, and pains had been taken to discipline them and put them in a condition for the particular kind of service to be performed. But a delay of operations, besides being dictated by the measures that were pursuing towards a pacific termination of the war, had been in itself deemed preferable to immature efforts. The humane system which has since been successfully pursued, of gradually civilizing the savages by improving their condition, of diverting them in some degree from hunting to domestic and agricultural occupations, by imparting to them some of the most simple and useful acquisitions of society, and of conciliating them to the United States by a beneficial and well-regulated commerce, had ever been a favorite object with the President, and the detailed view which was now taken of Indian affairs was concluded with a repetition of his recommendations of these measures. The subject next adverted to in the speech was the impediments which in some places continued to embarrass the collection of the duties on spirits distilled within the United States. After observing that these impediments were lessening in local extent, but the symptoms of such increased opposition had lately manifested themselves in certain places as, in his judgment, to render his special interposition advisable, the President added, "Congress may be assured that nothing within constitutional and legal limits, which may depend on me, shall be wanting to assert and maintain the just authority of the laws. In fulfilling this trust, I shall count entirely on the full cooperation of the other departments of government and upon the zealous support of all good citizens." After noticing various objects which would require the attention of the Legislature, the President addressed himself particularly to the House of Representatives and said, "I entertain a strong hope that the state of the national finances is now sufficiently matured to enable you to enter upon a systematic and effectual arrangement for the regular redemption and discharge of the public debt according to the right which has been reserved to the Government. No measure can be more desirable, whether viewed with an eye to its intrinsic importance or to the general sentiments and wish of the nation." The addresses of the two houses in answer to this speech were as usual respectful and affectionate. The several subjects recommended to the attention of Congress were noticed either in general terms or in a manner to indicate a coincidence of sentiment between the legislative and executive departments. The turbulent spirit which had manifested itself in certain parts of the Union was mentioned by both houses with a just degree of censure, and the measures adopted by the President, as well as the resolution he expressed to compel obedience to the laws, were approved, and the House of Representatives, in the most unqualified terms, declared opinions in favor of systematic and effectual arrangements for discharging the public debt. But the subsequent proceedings of the Legislature did not fulfill the expectations excited by this auspicious commencement of the session. At an early day, in a committee of the whole House on the President's speech, Mr. Fitzsimmons moved that measures for the reduction of so much of the public debt as the United States have a right to redeem ought to be adopted, and that the Secretary of the Treasury be directed to report a plan for that purpose. This motion was objected to by Mr. Madison as being premature. The state of the finances, he thought, was not sufficiently understood to authorize the adoption of the measure it contemplated. The debate, however, soon took a different direction. That part of the resolution which proposed a reference to the Secretary of the Treasury was particularly opposed, and an ardent discussion ensued, in which, without much essential variation, the arguments which had before been urged on the same subject were again employed. After a vehement contest, the motion to amend the resolution by striking out the proposed reference was overruled, and it was carried in its original form. 1793. In obedience to this order, the Secretary made a report in which he proposed a plan for the annual redemption of that portion of the debt, the payment of which was warranted by the contract between the United States and their creditors. But the expenses of the Indian War rendering it, in his opinion, unsafe to rest absolutely on the existing revenue, he proposed to extend the internal taxes to pleasure horses or pleasure carriages, as the Legislature might deem most eligible. The consideration of this report was deferred on various pretexts, and a motion was made to reduce the military establishment. The debate on this subject was peculiarly earnest, and in its progress the mode of conducting the Indian war, the relative merits and expensiveness of militia and of regular troops, and the danger to liberty from standing armies were elaborately discussed. It was not until the 4th of January that the motion was rejected. While that question remained undecided, the report of the Secretary was unavoidably postponed because on its determination would depend, in the opinion of many, the necessity of additional taxes. It would seem not improbable that the opponents of the American system of finances, who constituted rather a minority of the present Congress, but who indulged sanguine hopes of becoming the majority in the next, were desirous of referring every question relating to the Treasury Department to the succeeding legislature, in which there would be a more full representation of the people. Whatever might be the operating motives for delay, neither the extension of the law imposing a duty on spirits distilled within the United States to the territory northwest of the river Ohio, nor the plan for redeeming the public debt, which was earnestly pressed by the administration, could be carried through the present Congress. Those who claimed the favor and confidence of the people as a just reward for their general attachment to liberty, and especially for their watchfulness to prevent every augmentation of debt, were found in opposition to a system for its diminution, which was urged by men who were incessantly charged with entertaining designs for its excessive accumulation, in order to render it the corrupt instrument of executive influence. It might be expected that the public attention would be attracted to such a circumstance, but when party passions are highly inflamed, reason itself submits to their control and becomes the instrument of their will. The assertion that the existing revenues, if not prodigally or corruptly wasted, were sufficient for the objects contemplated by the President in his speech would constitute an ample apology for the impediments thrown in the way of a system which could not be directly disapproved, and would justify a continuance of the charge that the supporters of the fiscal system were friends to the augmentation of the public debt. Soon after the motion for the reduction of the military establishment was disposed of, another subject was introduced, which effectually postponed for the present session every measure connected with the finances of the nation. An act of Congress which passed on the 4th of August, 1790, authorized the President to cause to be borrowed any sum not exceeding $12 millions to be applied in payment of the foreign debt of the United States. A subsequent act, which passed on the 12th of the same month, authorized another loan not exceeding $2 millions to be applied in aid of the sinking fund towards the extinguishment of the domestic debt. A power to make these loans was delegated by the President to the Secretary of the Treasury by a general commission referring to the acts. This commission was accompanied by written instructions directing the payment of such parts of the foreign debt as should become due at the end of the year 1791, but leaving the Secretary, with respect to the residue, to be regulated by the interests of the United States. Under this commission, 2 loans were negotiated in 1790 and others at subsequent periods. As many considerations of convenience opposed such an arrangement as would appropriate all the moneys arising from either of these loans to one object, to the total exclusion of the other, and no motive was perceived for thus unnecessarily fettering the operations of the Treasury, each loan was negotiated under both laws, and consequently the moneys produced by each were applicable to both objects in such proportions as the President might direct. It has been already observed that his written instructions had ordered the payment of those installments of the foreign debt which should become due before the 1st of January, 1792. But no further sums on that account were to be borrowed until supplemental orders to that effect should be given, unless a loan could be made on such terms as would render it advantageous to the United States to anticipate the payments to their foreign creditors. It being the opinion of both the President and Secretary that the official powers of the latter authorized him to draw the moneys borrowed for domestic purposes into the Treasury, where they would form a part of the sinking fund and be applicable to the objects of that fund in conformity with the laws of appropriation, no written instructions were given respecting that part of the subject, but in the progress of the business every material step which was taken was communicated to the President, and his directions obtained upon it. While the chief magistrate remained at the seat of government, these communications were verbal. When absent, they were made by letter. At this period the domestic debt bore a low price in the market, and foreign capital was pouring into the United States for its purchase. The immediate application of the sinking fund to this object would consequently acquire a large portion of the debt, and would also accelerate its appreciation. The best interests of the United States and his own fame thus impelling the Secretary to give the operations of the sinking fund the utmost activity of which it was susceptible, he had, with the approbation of the President, directed a part of the first loan to be paid in discharge of the installments of the foreign debt which were actually due, and had drawn a part of it into the public treasury in aid of the sinking fund. In May 1791, instructions were given to the agent of the United States in Europe to apply the proceeds of future loans, as they should accrue, in payments to France, except such sums as should be previously and specially reserved. In the execution of these instructions some delay intervened, which was to be ascribed, among other causes, to representations made by the French Minister of Marine that a plan would be adopted, to which a decree of the National Assembly was requisite for converting a large sum into supplies for San Domingo, and to a desire on the part of the agent to settle, previously to further payments, a definitive rule by which the moneys paid should be liquidated and credited to the United States. The disordered state of French affairs protracted both the one and the other of these causes of delay to a later period than had been expected, and in the meantime the Secretary continued to draw into the United States such portions of these loans as were destined to be brought in aid of the sinking fund. Such was the state of this transaction when the commencement of those calamities which have finally overwhelmed San Domingo induced the American government, on the urgent application of the French minister, to furnish supplies to that ill-fated colony in payment of the debt to France. This being a mode of payment which to a certain extent was desired by the creditor and was advantageous to the debtor, a consequent disposition prevailed to use it so far as might comport with the wish of the French government, and a part of the money designed for foreign purposes was drawn into the United States. In the course of these operations a portion of the installments actually due to France had been permitted to remain unsatisfied. A part of the money borrowed in Europe being thus applicable to the extinguishment of the domestic debt, and a part of the domestic revenue being applicable to the payment of interest due on the loans made in Europe, the Secretary of the Treasury had appropriated a part of the money arising from foreign loans to the payment of interest due abroad, which had been replaced by the application of money in the Treasury arising from domestic resources to the purchase of the domestic debt. The Secretary had not deemed it necessary to communicate these operations in detail to the legislature, but some hints respecting them having been derived either from certain papers which accompanied a report made to the House of Representatives early in the session, or from some other source, Mr. Giles, on the 23rd of January, moved several resolutions requiring information, among other things, on the various points growing out of these loans, and the application of the moneys arising from them, and respecting the unapplied revenues of the United States, and the places in which the sums so unapplied were deposited. In the speech introducing these resolutions, observations were made which very intelligibly implied charges of a much more serious nature than inattention to the exact letter of an appropriation law. Estimates were made to support the position that a large balance of public money was unaccounted for. The resolutions were agreed to without debate, and in a few days the Secretary transmitted a report containing the information that was required. This report comprehended a full exposition of the views and motives which had regulated the conduct of the Department, and a very able justification of the measures which had been adopted, but omitted to state explicitly that part of the money borrowed in Europe had been drawn into the United States with the sanction of the President. It is also chargeable with some expressions which cannot be pronounced unexceptionable, but which may find their apology in the feelings of a mind conscious of its own uprightness, and wounded by the belief that the proceedings against him had originated in a spirit hostile to fair inquiry. These resolutions, the observations which accompanied them, and the first number of the report were the signals for a combined attack on the Secretary of the Treasury through the medium of the press. Many anonymous writers appeared who assailed the head of that department with a degree of bitterness indicative of the spirit in which the inquiry was to be conducted. Resolutions implicating the Secretary of the Treasury rejected. On the 27th of February, not many days after the last number of the report was received, Mr. Giles moved sundry resolutions which were founded on the information before the House. The idea of a balance, unaccounted for, was necessarily relinquished, but the Secretary of the Treasury was charged with neglect of duty in failing to give Congress official information of the moneys drawn by him from Europe into the United States, with violating the law of the 4th of August, 1790, by applying a portion of the principal borrowed under it to the payment of interest, and by drawing a part of the same moneys into the United States without instructions from the President, with deviating from the instructions of the President in other respects, with negotiating a loan at the bank, contrary to the public interest, while public moneys to a greater amount than were required lay unemployed in the bank, and with an indecorum to the House, in undertaking to judge of its motives, in calling for information which was demandable of him from the constitution of his office, and in failing to give all the necessary information within his knowledge relative to subjects on which certain specified references had been previously made to him. These resolutions were followed by one directing that a copy of them should be transmitted to the President of the United States. The debate on this subject, which commenced on the 28th of February, was continued to the 1st of March, and was conducted with a spirit of acrimony towards the Secretary, demonstrating the soreness of the wounds that had been given and received in the political and party wars which had been previously waged. It terminated in a rejection of all the resolutions, the highest number voting in favor of any one of them was 16. Congress adjourns. On the 3rd of March, a constitutional period was put to the existence of the present Congress. The members separated with obvious symptoms of extreme irritation. Various causes, the most prominent of which have already been noticed, had combined to organize two distinct parties in the United States which were rapidly taking the form of a ministerial and an opposition party. By that in opposition, the President was not yet openly renounced. His personal influence was too great to be encountered by a direct avowal that he was at the head of their adversaries, and his public conduct did not admit of a suspicion that he could allow himself to rank as the chief of a party, nor could public opinion be seduced to implicate him in the ambitious plans and dark schemes for the subversion of liberty, which were ascribed to a part of the administration and to the leading members who had supported the measures of finance adopted by the legislature. Yet it was becoming apparent that things were taking a course which must inevitably involve him in the political conflicts which were about to take place. It was apparent that the charges against the Secretary of the Treasury would not be relinquished, and that they were of a nature to affect the Chief Magistrate materially, should his countenance not be withdrawn from that officer. It was equally apparent that the fervor of democracy, which was perpetually manifesting itself in the papers, in invectives against levies, against the trappings of royalty, and against the marks of peculiar respect which were paid to the President, must soon include him more pointedly in its strictures. These divisions, which are inherent in the nature of popular governments, by which the Chief Magistrate, however unexceptionable his conduct and however exalted his character, must sooner or later be more or less affected, were beginning to be essentially influenced by the great events of Europe. Progress of the French Revolution and its effects on parties in the United States. That revolution, which has been the admiration, the wonder, and the terror of the civilized world, had from its commencement been viewed in America with the deepest interest. In its first stage, but one sentiment respecting it prevailed, and that was a belief accompanied with an ardent wish that it would improve the condition of France, extend the blessings of liberty, and promote the happiness of the human race. When the labors of the Convention had terminated in a written constitution, this unanimity of opinion was in some degree impaired by a few who had thought deeply on the science of government, and who, if not more intelligent, certainly judged more dispassionately than their fellow citizens. That instrument was believed to contain the principles of self-destruction. It was feared that a system so ill-balanced could not be permanent. A deep impression was made on the same persons by the influence of the galleries over the legislature, and of mobs over the executive by the tumultuous assemblages of the people and their licentious excesses during the short and sickly existence of the regal authority. These did not appear to be the symptoms of a healthy constitution or of genuine freedom. Persuaded that the present state of things could not last, they doubted and they feared for the future. In total opposition to this sentiment was that of the public. There seems to be something infectious in the example of a powerful and enlightened nation verging towards democracy, which imposes on the human mind and leaves human reason in fetters. Novelties introduced by such a nation are stripped of the objections which have been preconceived against them, and long settled opinions yield to the overwhelming weight of such dazzling authority. It wears the semblance of being the sense of mankind, breaking loose from the shackles which have been imposed by artifice, and asserting the freedom and the dignity of his nature. The Constitution of France, therefore, was generally received with unqualified plaudits. The establishment of a legislature consisting of a single body was defended not only as being adapted to the particular situation of that country, but as being right in itself. Certain anonymous writers, who supported the theory of a balanced government, were branded as the advocates of royalty and of aristocracy. To question the duration of the present order of things was thought to evidence an attachment to unlimited monarchy, or a blind prejudice in favor of British institutions, and the partiality of America in favor of a Senate was visibly declining. In this stage of the Revolution, however, the division of sentiment was not marked with sufficient distinctness, nor the passions of the people agitated with sufficient violence for any powerful effect to be produced on the two parties in America. But when the monarchy was completely overthrown and a republic decreed, the people of the United States seemed electrified by the measure, and its influence was felt by the whole society. The war in which the several potentates of Europe were engaged against France, although in almost every instance declared by that power, was pronounced to be a war for the extirpation of human liberty and for the banishment of free government from the face of the earth. The preservation of the Constitution of the United States was supposed to depend on its issue, and the coalition against France was treated as a coalition against America also. A cordial wish for the success of the French arms, or rather that the war might terminate without any diminution of French power, and in such a manner as to leave the people of that country free to choose their own form of government, was perhaps universal. But respecting the probable issue of their internal conflicts, perfect unanimity of opinion did not prevail. By some few individuals, the practicability of governing by a system formed on the republican model, an immense populous and military nation whose institutions, habits, and morals were adapted to monarchy, and which was surrounded by armed neighbors, was deemed a problem which time alone could solve. The circumstances under which the abolition of royalty was declared, the massacres which preceded it, the scenes of turbulence and violence which were acted in every part of the nation, appeared to them to present an awful and doubtful state of things, respecting which no certain calculations could be made, and the idea that a republic was to be introduced and supported by force was to them a paradox in politics. Under the influence of these appearances, the apprehension was entertained that if the ancient monarchy should not be restored, a military despotism would be established. By the many, these unpopular doubts were deemed unpardonable heresies, and the few to whom they were imputed were pronounced hostile to liberty. A suspicion that the unsettled state of things in France had contributed to suspend the payment of the debt to that nation had added to the asperity with which the resolutions on that subject were supported, and the French Revolution will be found to have had great influence on the strength of parties and on the subsequent political transactions of the United States. End of Chapter 7, Part 3. End of the Life of Washington, Volume 4, by John Marshall.